Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now we will begin with Story 1, The Cellar of Silence, the imprisonment of Bishop Odo. The air in the cellar beneath Rouen Castle was not always damp. At least, not to the extent one might imagine. Despite centuries of later romanticism, the medieval dungeon was not invariably a rat-infested hole beneath the earth, at least not for someone like Odo of Bayeux, half-brother to William the Conqueror, Bishop, and once Earl of Kent. Yet in the early spring of 1082, Odo sat alone behind a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands, under the personal orders of the King of England himself. The silence was thick, not the silence of peace, but the political silence that follows betrayal. A bishop beyond the cloth. Odo was no ordinary bishop. Appointed at a young age, likely in his early 20s, he was not chosen for his spiritual insight but his loyalty. William, ever the calculating Duke-turned-king, understood the value of family on the battlefield and in court. Odo was more warrior than priest, often wielding power through land holdings and military campaigns rather than pastoral care. By 1067, William had rewarded him with the title of Earl of Kent, making Odo one of the richest men in England. Some contemporary chroniclers described him as second only to the king in wealth. With this came ambition and the seeds of a dramatic fall. Rouen, a castle of secrets. Rouen Castle, where Odo was eventually confined, was not yet the stone keep that later stood. The cellars were likely constructed of timber and earth, later rebuilt in stone. Even in its earliest form, the castle served the vital administrative and punitive roles common to Norman governance, a place where power could be stored and where those who threatened it could be tucked away. Prison in the medieval world was rarely a punishment in itself. It was a means to an end: extortion, diplomacy, interrogation. For a man like Odo, his incarceration was both a statement and a delay tactic. William could not execute his own brother, not without serious consequences, so he chose silence instead. The cellar was likely lit by a small slit for air and light, not much more. Food, when it came, was delivered by a servant who did not speak. This was no oubliette, a place to be forgotten, but it was close. What had he done? The chroniclers were uncertain. William of Malmesbury suggested that Odo had overreached by planning a military expedition to Italy, perhaps to claim the papacy. The idea seems ludicrous on the surface, a bishop seeking to become pope through force. But in the turbulent politics of the late 11th century, it was not impossible. Rome was in flux. The investiture controversy raged. The very power to appoint bishops like Odo was being wrestled from kings by popes. Perhaps Odo thought he could restore balance, or perhaps it was greed. After all, papal lands were vast and lucrative. William's patience had already been tested. Odo's abuse of English lands, his defiance of royal authority, and his lavish building projects, all these were tolerated barely. But open defiance, that was a different matter. Captivity as control. The silence of Odo's cell was not just physical, it was strategic. William ordered his court to say nothing about the arrest. No trial, no public accusations. The king's half-brother was simply gone. This was not unusual. Political prisoners were often disappeared without ceremony. The threat they posed was too great to allow spectacle, and in truth, imprisonment could be more politically useful than execution. A living prisoner could still be used as leverage. Food was delivered in modest quantities. Records from similar cases show prisoners receiving barley bread, ale, and sometimes meat. For Odo, the diet may have been slightly better, perhaps not out of kindness, but status. He was likely guarded not by common soldiers, but by stewards of the king's household, men loyal to William, and too fearful to speak with the prisoner. Time in the medieval cell. Unlike modern prisons, There was no expectation of rehabilitation. There were no official rules about cell size, sanitation, or duration of imprisonment. The law varied widely between Norman, Frankish, and ecclesiastical jurisdictions. But in Odo's case, the lack of formal process was precisely the point. He was not in prison for a crime. He was imprisoned because he was inconvenient. The cell may have been furnished with a simple cot, straw mattress, and perhaps a small writing table, though it is doubtful Odo was allowed correspondence. Solitude was a form of pressure. The aim was not to punish but to break ambition. Over time, days would have blurred. The rhythm of the castle would go on above him, guards changing shifts, cooks preparing food, messages carried by royal riders. He was buried in soundless proximity to power, yet utterly cut off. The politics of containment. Odo's imprisonment was significant for another reason: it set a precedent. A bishop could be imprisoned by a king. It flew in the face of growing papal doctrine that churchmen were outside the jurisdiction of secular rulers. This act, silent though it was, echoed into the political debates of the next century. When Thomas Becket resisted King Henry II almost a century later, he could look back to Odo's cell and understand what was at stake. The king's power over the church was not merely theoretical, it had precedent in iron and timber, in darkness and straw. Echoes in stone. Centuries later, the myth of Odo's cell took on a life of its own. Tourists to Rouen would be shown damp, mossy chambers and told, "This is where the bishop lay." But no one truly remembered the shape of the room or the sounds it held. What mattered was the symbolism. A man of the cloth, bound by family, undone by ambition, silenced by a brother king. And yet, even in silence, history remembers. But how long can ambition be kept quiet before it seeks the light again? The silence of Bishop Odo's imprisonment was not simply a matter of stone and restraint. It became, in time, a tool, perhaps even a weapon, of King William. Political power in the Middle Ages was often loud, filled with proclamations, trials, and public hangings. But occasionally, as in Odo's case, it moved in silence. And it is in that silence that one begins to hear the hidden mechanisms of medieval politics. William the Conqueror had made a decision rare among medieval monarchs: to imprison his half-brother without trial, without record, and most importantly, without explanation. And though many chronicles would come later, they were written in the absence of certainty. The silence left space for rumor, theory, and manipulation, each as valuable as truth. A bishop's fall from grace. Why would William risk the wrath of the church by imprisoning a bishop, especially one of his own blood? The answer lies not only in Odo's ambition, but in his brazen disregard for royal boundaries. Sources such as Orderic Vitalis and William of Poitiers, though biased, paint a portrait of a man whose wealth was only surpassed by his pride. By 1082, Odo had become increasingly independent. He abused his authority as Earl of Kent, taxed the peasantry beyond custom, and built fortified residences, some say, with the air of royalty. He traveled with a retinue that rivaled the king's own, and most notably, he began raising funds and men for a journey south, perhaps to Rome, perhaps to Naples, or perhaps only to claim a greater ecclesiastical post. William, then busy consolidating his conquest and struggling to keep control over his Norman and Anglo-Saxon vassals, could not allow even a hint of rebellion to fester. He could not ignore a brother who acted as though the crown were a matter of inheritance rather than conquest. And so, at a royal council in Normandy, Odo was arrested swiftly, silently, and without struggle. Prison, not penance. It is easy to forget that Odo was still a bishop. Medieval bishops were exempt from secular punishments under canon law, though this concept was increasingly under pressure by secular rulers. Papal reforms in the late 11th century under Pope Gregory VII emphasized the separation of spiritual and temporal authority. William, however, had no interest in Rome's legal distinctions. He had fought a brutal war to become King of England and had already defied Pope Alexander II by appointing bishops and abbots himself. Odo's imprisonment was therefore not just personal, it was a statement of authority. Yet the imprisonment was done carefully. William avoided accusations of spiritual violation by asserting that Odo was arrested not for his religious role, but for his secular misdeeds as Earl of Kent. A technical distinction, perhaps, but one that reflected the careful legal balancing act of the age. There was no penance, no ecclesiastical trial, just cold confinement. Life in the cell, beyond stone walls. If we shift focus from the legal to the personal, the question becomes, what did Odo think during these years? Medieval prisoners were rarely idle, especially those of high status. Odo, who had once overseen the building of Rochester Castle and likely played a role in the Bayeux Tapestries Commission, was no simple brute. He was educated, likely fluent in Latin and Norman French, and deeply aware of his position in history. In the solitude of his cell, he may have meditated on scripture, replayed court intrigues in his mind, or composed mental defenses. There are no surviving writings from his imprisonment, but silence does not mean inactivity. He may have had a chaplain visit occasionally under guard. He may have been permitted a book or two. Psalters were common among the literate imprisoned elite. Straw bedding would have been the norm, replaced occasionally. A slop bucket and a single window would have framed his existence. Dust, not darkness, was his constant companion. And yet it was a soft confinement by medieval standards. Comparative captivity. To fully understand Odo's situation, it helps to compare it to other captives of his era. Common criminals were rarely imprisoned at all. Fines, mutilation, or execution were preferred. Prisons, when they did exist, were for debtors, hostages, or political nuisances. Consider the noble hostages of feudal disputes, such as those taken after the Battle of Hastings or the many captured during the anarchy of King Stephen's reign. They were often kept in comfort but under constant threat. Then there were the ecclesiastical prisoners, monks or clergy condemned for heresy or disobedience. These were sometimes imprisoned within monasteries themselves, locked behind wooden doors in cells barely wider than a coffin. Odo's cell was neither monastery nor oubliette. It was a political pause. Family power and the calculus of blood. There's an uncomfortable truth that pulses beneath Odo's captivity. William's choice to imprison his own brother reflected both the strength and the limits of feudal kingship. William, for all his titles, was constantly under siege politically, militarily, and spiritually. His conquest of England in 1066 had not ended in peace, but in a long period of suppression. Rebellions flared in the north and the west. The Welsh borderlands were in turmoil. The Northumbrian nobility, both Anglo-Saxon and Danish, plotted in secret. In such a context, the king could not tolerate an ambitious noble with a strong power base, especially if that noble also had papal connections and royal blood. Yet William did not kill Odo. He imprisoned him, effectively diffusing the threat without martyring his brother. The choice speaks volumes. Blood ties still mattered, even when power was at stake. Or perhaps it was strategy. Odo might still be useful someday. Would Odo's loyalty return if given freedom? The outside world moves on. While Odo sat in silence, the world did not stop. In 1083, Queen Matilda died. William was devastated, and some chroniclers note a shift in his demeanor after her passing. He became colder, more withdrawn, and increasingly suspicious of those around him. The Domesday Book began in 1085, a vast survey of England's resources and landowners. Odo's name appears, stripped of many of his former holdings. Though he was still technically Earl of Kent, much of his power had been redistributed. In this way, William neutralized his brother's influence without a single public word. The king did not need to explain. He simply acted. It was bureaucracy wielded like a sword. The long wait. Odo remained imprisoned for 5 years. We don't know exactly when he began to sense the possibility of release or if he did. But in 1087, as William lay dying after an accident in Manse, everything changed. It is said that on his deathbed, William gave in to pressure from family members and nobles. Perhaps guilt, perhaps pragmatism. He ordered Odo's release. And so, without fanfare, the cellar door opened. Odo walked free, not back into a church, but into a court already brimming with tension. William's sons, Robert Curthose in Normandy, William Rufus in England, were preparing to fight for their inheritances. The silence was over. Odo, the silent prisoner, would become a vocal player once more. But how would the years of silence shape his return to the world of noise, intrigue, and war? When the cellar door of Rouen Castle finally opened in 1087, Odo of Bayeux stepped into a world vastly changed. The man who had entered that room 5 years earlier had been the second most powerful man in England, Bishop of Bayeux and Earl of Kent. Now, he was none of these in practice, if not in title. The silence that had defined his captivity had also marked a transformation of political Europe. William the Conqueror was dead. The carefully managed empire of England and Normandy had begun to fracture, and the future was uncertain. In that chaos, men like Odo thrived or perished. A king dies, and brothers turn on each other. William died on 9 September 1087, following an injury from a horse accident while burning the French town of Manse. Even in death, William remained a calculating figure. He split his empire. Normandy was given to his eldest son, Robert Curthose, while England went to William Rufus, the second son. This division, however logical it may have seemed, violated the feudal expectation of a single inheritance. It created immediate tension between the brothers and their followers, and Odo, freshly freed, found himself in a position to choose sides. He did not hesitate. Odo cast his lot with Robert Curthose, perhaps believing the eldest son had the stronger claim, or perhaps remembering William Rufus as the lesser of the brothers, the younger, the less tested, the more resented. Yet the stakes had changed. Odo would no longer be content as a quiet bishop. The years in silence had sharpened his sense of political timing. The Rebellion of 1088. In the spring of 1088, barely months after William Rufus took the throne, Odo led a rebellion across England. His allies were substantial, a faction of Anglo-Norman barons, many of whom still owned lands in both England and Normandy. Their goal was to depose William Rufus and install Robert as King of England, thus reuniting the conqueror's lands. It was the largest internal threat William Rufus would face in his early reign. Odo's plan was ambitious. He fortified Rochester Castle, rallied forces in Kent, and coordinated uprisings from Durham to the west of England. He even appealed to the Old English nobility, many of whom still remembered the brutality of the Norman conquest. There are suggestions that he promised greater leniency, perhaps even a return to certain English customs. But if the rebellion had one flaw, it was timing. Robert Curthose never came. Whether out of indecision, lack of resources, or simple cowardice, Robert failed to cross the Channel to support his English allies. Odo was left exposed. Siege and surrender at Rochester. William Rufus responded with impressive speed and brutality. He moved against the rebels with a royal army, capturing key towns and marching toward Rochester, where Odo had taken refuge. By summer 1088, the siege of Rochester had begun. Accounts describe a long and difficult siege. Odo's garrison was well supplied initially, but over time disease began to spread. The conditions of medieval sieges were always grim. Food spoiled, water ran low, and the stench of human waste mixed with the moaning of the wounded. Eventually, the garrison begged Odo to negotiate. He did. The terms of surrender were simple. William Rufus promised the rebels would be spared if they opened the gates, and so they did. But when the rebels exited the castle, they were nearly lynched by Rufus's army. The king intervened personally, reminding his men of the oaths sworn during negotiation. The act was calculated. William Rufus, though ruthless, understood the value of royal trust. Still, Odo's fate was sealed. Exile again. For the second time in his life, Odo had lost everything. His English estates were confiscated. His role in the church was still technically intact. Rome had never formally stripped him of his bishopric, but his political power was gone. William Rufus, perhaps following his father's example, chose not to kill Odo. Instead, he exiled him from England forever. Odo returned to Normandy. The details of his later life are sparse, scattered among chronicles and marginal references. He remained in the circle of Robert Curthose, a loyal supporter in his cousin's chaotic reign. It was a strange echo of the past, still a bishop, still a political player, but never again a true power. Odo and the First Crusade. There is some debate about Odo's involvement with the First Crusade, which began in 1096. Some sources suggest he took the cross and intended to travel to Jerusalem. Others imply he died en route. In truth, there is no definitive evidence that Odo ever made it to the Holy Land. What is certain is that he died in Palermo, Sicily, in either 1096 or 1097, while on his way east. He died far from Bayeux, far from England, and far from the stone cell where he had once waited in silence. His body was buried in the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Caen, the very abbey founded by his brother William the Conqueror. The legacy of captivity. Odo's imprisonment was more than a family affair. It was a moment of transformation in medieval kingship. By detaining a bishop without trial, William asserted a precedent that royal power could supersede ecclesiastical immunity when state survival was at stake. This act foreshadowed the conflicts of the 12th century, including the infamous clash between Henry II and Thomas Becket. It shaped the English crown's relationship with the church and demonstrated that even the highest among clergy could be humbled. Odo's silent years in Rouen were not wasted. They marked a turning point in the balance of power between king and bishop, between family loyalty and political necessity. And they invite a broader question, still lingering across the pages of medieval history. How much silence does it take to change the course of power? And when the silence ends, who controls the story that follows? Story 2. Chains Beneath the Crown, the Tower of London's early prison. It was not built for prisoners, not originally, anyway. The White Tower, the central structure of what we now call the Tower of London, was constructed beginning in 1078 under the orders of William the Conqueror. Its thick limestone walls rose above the River Thames, a defiant monument of Norman power embedded in a recently conquered Anglo-Saxon city. It was both fortress and symbol, a message carved in stone. The Normans were here to stay. But as with so many monuments of might, it quickly took on another function. It became a place to put people, specifically those who stood in the way of the crown. And so began the long, slow evolution of the tower into a place of chains, silence, and whispered suffering. From fortress to holding cell. The earliest references to the tower being used for imprisonment appear in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. It was not yet the sprawling complex we imagine today, with its moat, walls, and infamous bloody tower. At first, it was just the White Tower, 4 massive walls enclosing a keep. But even then, its role in maintaining royal authority was clear. In the medieval period, kings did not govern from afar, they ruled by visible presence. Their fortresses, especially in conquered territory, were part of this display. The Tower of London stood not just to repel invaders, but to remind the English of their subjugation. And where better to store political enemies than beneath that symbol? Early prisoners were typically high-ranking rebellious barons, problematic clerics, or unlucky heirs. There were no cells carved for common thieves or pickpockets. This was a political prison before it was anything else. Ralph Flambard, the first inmate. The Tower's first recorded prisoner was Ralph Flambard, imprisoned in 1100. He was no common man. As Bishop of Durham and chief financial administrator under William Rufus, William II, Flambard was deeply entangled in the Norman monarchy's affairs. Known for imposing heavy taxes and orchestrating land seizures, Flambard was a figure of resentment feared by barons, hated by the English peasantry. When Henry I took the throne in 1100 following Rufus's sudden death in a hunting accident, Flambard was among the first targets. He was accused of corruption and swiftly imprisoned in the Tower. But Flambard's story would set a curious precedent. He escaped, smuggling in a rope hidden inside a wine cask, or so the chroniclers claim. He managed to climb from a window and flee to Normandy, where he joined Robert Curthos's effort to challenge Henry's rule. This was not just a jailbreak, it was a political embarrassment. For the Tower to lose its only prisoner so soon after gaining him was a warning. The fortress was strong but not infallible. It needed better walls, better watchers, and perhaps most importantly, better fear. The function of imprisonment in medieval England. To modern ears, the word prison conjures images of long sentences, barred cells, and rows of convicts. But in the 12th century, imprisonment was rarely a punishment in itself. People were held in captivity to await trial, to extract a ransom, or to remove them from public life temporarily. Execution was swift and public. Mutilation such as loss of a hand or eye was common for theft and rebellion. But imprisonment, that was for nobles, for those whose value extended beyond their death. And the Tower of London, by the mid-1100s, was quickly becoming the Crown's preferred place to keep such individuals. Stephen and Maud, Civil War and the Tower's growing role. During the period known as the Anarchy, 1135–1154, the Tower became more than a fortress or occasional holding cell. It became a strategic asset in the chaos of civil war. When Henry I died in 1135, he left the throne to his daughter, Empress Matilda or Maud. But her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the crown instead. The resulting civil conflict tore England apart for nearly 2 decades, with barons switching allegiances, castles being sacked, and entire regions descending into lawlessness. In this power struggle, the Tower of London was key. Stephen recognized the need to secure the capital and held the tower tightly. It served as both military garrison and prison for captured rebels and rival nobles. When Matilda gained the upper hand, she too understood its significance. It was not just a building, it was a symbol of control. By the 1140s, the tower had begun to expand. The curtain wall was built, new towers were added, and the fortress became a complex design not only for defense, but for long-term detention. The prisoners changed too. No longer just individual threats like Flambard, now they included entire factions, barons who had pledged to Stephen but switched to Matilda or vice versa. These were not criminals, they were chess pieces. Captivity by class. The experience of imprisonment in the Tower varied drastically depending on who you were. A high-ranking noble could expect relative comfort, at least in theory. He might be housed in one of the Tower chambers, attended by a servant, and permitted correspondence. Food would be decent, sometimes even provided from his own estates. But comfort is relative. Chroniclers speak of damp walls, bitter winters, and the ever-present fear of being forgotten. Noble or not, one's fate depended entirely on the monarch's mood, and on whether you were more valuable alive or dead. Lower-status prisoners, while rare, suffered far more. Cramped cells, minimal food, and no communication were the norm. Some may have been kept in pits or under guard in the outer buildings. These men often left no records, just notches in the wall, if that. The tower's emerging reputation. By the mid-12th century, the tower was no longer just another Norman keep. It had become an institution feared, whispered about, and increasingly associated with disappearance. Yet torture at this stage was still rare in England. Unlike continental powers, the English monarchy had not yet fully embraced judicial torture. That would come later, particularly during the reign of Edward I and the Tudor monarchs. Still, the psychological pressure of captivity was immense. Prisoners in the tower were not just physically constrained, they were politically neutralized, erased from the world outside. Their absence spoke volumes. A fortress in transition. It is worth remembering that during this time, the Tower of London was not exclusively a prison. It served multiple functions. Royal residence. Kings occasionally stayed there during times of unrest. Armory. Weapons and armor were stored and maintained. Treasury. Royal funds and records were sometimes kept within. Mint. By the 12th century, coins were being minted in the tower. This mixture of purposes created a unique environment. A prisoner might hear soldiers drilling in the yard, smiths hammering metal, and royal officials counting coins, all while wondering whether they would ever walk free again. The line between administrative center and place of dread was thin. A quiet descent into the future. By the time Stephen and Matilda's war came to a close in 1154, with Henry II ascending the throne, the Tower of London had firmly established itself in the English psyche. No longer just a Norman fortress, it was now the stage for royal power, political punishment, and elite suffering. But the worst was still to come. The Plantagenets would refine the tower's role. Torture chambers would emerge, executions would be staged, and by the 13th and 14th centuries, the tower would be synonymous with fear. Yet it is in these quieter early years when prisoners like Flambard plotted escape, and civil wars raged outside that the tower's legacy was laid stone by silent stone. And as the iron gates closed behind yet another nobleman, one could only wonder, how long before the tower spoke in screams, not whispers? The coronation of Henry II in 1154 brought an end to the anarchy, but it did not bring peace. England's kingship remained a position perched on a knife's edge, forever under threat from rebellious barons, disgruntled clergy, and ambitious heirs. In this crucible of unrest, the Tower of London evolved. No longer simply a Norman relic or military outpost, it hardened into something else, a tool for political domination, a quiet engine of royal control. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the tower emerge as a central player in England's statecraft, not through spectacle, but through its silence, the kind enforced by stone walls and iron bars. It became a royal cage for nobles, royals, and sometimes even kings. A tower fit for power. Under Henry II, the tower's infrastructure was expanded significantly. While the White Tower remained the heart of the complex, additional walls, towers, and defensive features were added. By the late 12th century, under Richard the Lionheart, the tower's outer curtain wall had begun to take its familiar shape. This was not just an architectural shift, it reflected a deeper transformation in how the English monarchy viewed power. Control of London meant control of the kingdom, and control of the tower meant mastery over both. The tower became the physical embodiment of the crown's ability to isolate, intimidate, and dominate. William Longchamp and the power struggle of 1191. An early and instructive episode in the tower's growing political role occurred during the reign of Richard I, while the king was off on the Third Crusade. England fell into the hands of regents and stewards. Chief among them was William Longchamp, Bishop of Ely and Chancellor of England. Longchamp used the tower as a base of operations, reinforcing its walls, expanding its arsenal, and, most controversially, using it to detain political enemies. He imprisoned nobles without clear charges, threatened London's merchants, and ruled with the arrogance of someone certain of his security. But Longchamp made a fatal mistake. He underestimated John, Richard's younger brother and future king. In 1191, John led a coup against Longchamp with the backing of Londoners furious over the Chancellor's abuses. The Tower, once considered impregnable, was besieged. Though the siege was brief, it proved that even the Tower could not protect a man who lacked support. Longchamp was removed, the Tower remained. The lesson was clear. The Tower was not just for holding others, it was a throne from which one ruled or fell. The Magna Carta and the baronial backlash. The early 13th century brought further turmoil. King John's reign, 1199–1216, was marked by war, economic instability, and repeated confrontations with England's barons. The Tower once again stood at the center of this drama. John used the Tower ruthlessly. He garrisoned troops there, stored weapons, and detained hostages, including the sons of rebellious nobles. These were not prisoners in the traditional sense. They were insurance, living reminders to their families that disloyalty would cost more than land. But this tyranny bred resistance. In 1215, the barons revolted, forcing John to sign the Magna Carta. One of the grievances was his abuse of imprisonment. Though the document's famous clause, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice," did not directly abolish royal imprisonment, it set a tone. The Tower, once a symbol of conquest, now carried the stain of oppression. And yet it remained a necessary tool. When London fell to the rebel barons later that year, the Tower held fast. It was besieged but not taken. Even in disgrace, the Tower held its own. Hostages, nobles, and royal kin. Throughout the 13th century, the Tower continued to hold a particular type of prisoner, the politically valuable. Many were hostages, children, or spouses of nobles required to ensure their family's loyalty. The practice was common in feudal diplomacy, and the Tower offered a convenient and high-profile holding place. Others were detained after battle or rebellion. Take, for example, Hubert de Burgh, a former justiciar under King Henry III, who fell from favor in 1232 and was briefly imprisoned in the Tower. Though later pardoned, his case illustrates how swiftly favor could become captivity. Eleanor de Montfort, wife of Simon de Montfort, leader of the Second Barons' war against Henry III, was held at the Tower following her husband's death in 1265. Alongside her, many of her relatives were also captured and imprisoned. Eleanor's captivity was neither brief nor brutal. She was treated with a measure of dignity befitting her status, but she was effectively removed from political life. Her isolation was strategic. The Tower was a place to put not only enemies, but potential rallying points. The Tower's architecture of control. As the population of high-status prisoners grew, the Tower's structure adapted. New buildings were modified with chambers capable of secure yet respectable imprisonment. The Wakefield Tower, built under Henry III in the 1220s, likely served as a royal lodging and later as a prison. The Salt Tower and Bell Tower also became known for detaining noble captives. Each room was tailored. Some had fireplaces, windows, and furniture. Others were little more than stone vaults. The differences reflected social hierarchy and political calculus. But even in the best rooms, psychological pressure remained. Prisoners were watched, isolated from allies, and fed news in measured doses. Some were permitted books, chaplains, and writing materials. Others, nothing but silence. The Tower did not need chains to impose submission. The seeds of interrogation. Though England had not yet institutionalized torture, the 13th century saw the slow growth of harsher methods, especially for those accused of heresy or treason. There are no clear records of formal torture devices in the Tower before the 14th century, but some references suggest that unpleasant methods extended isolation, deprivation, and physical restraint were used to extract compliance or confession. The line between detainment and coercion blurred. In later centuries, instruments like the rack would become infamous, but in this early period, silence and uncertainty were often enough. A prisoner who heard the echo of footsteps above but no news might unravel from anxiety alone. This too was power, a fortress that watched itself. As the century closed, the tower had become more than a prison. It was a stage, a mirror, and a barometer of royal authority. When the tower held strong, so did the crown. When its gates opened for rebels or when its walls failed to contain dissent, kings trembled. But for all its power, the tower also held ghosts. The walls echoed with the prayers of imprisoned clerics, the whispered plots of nobles awaiting ransom, and the quiet despair of women like Eleanor de Montfort, caught between dynastic wars they never chose. The stones remembered. And as the next century loomed with all its wars, trials, and betrayals, one question remained. What happens when the tower becomes not just the king's tool, but his trap? By the dawn of the 14th century, the Tower of London had shed the last remnants of its original function as a military fortification alone. It had become something greater and darker. It was now a living institution, deeply entangled with the machinery of monarchy, rebellion, diplomacy, and fear. The tower was no longer simply a place of imprisonment. It was a stage, and its prisoners were often actors in a political performance played not before the public, but before a more intimate audience, the king, his court, and history itself. And as the English crown entered its most volatile century, the tower's role as a prison for the powerful deepened. This was the age of high-stakes captivity, where being locked behind the tower's walls was a pause before tragedy, a space between privilege and execution, between crown and axe. The reign of Edward I, administrative iron, and the rise of bureaucratic confinement. Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, ruled with ruthless efficiency. Under his reign, 1272–1307, the tower's use became increasingly institutionalized. No longer simply a reactive place of detainment, the tower became a planned part of state control. Records from Edward's reign show that prisoners were tracked with growing bureaucratic precision. Their rations, quarters, visitors, and correspondence were sometimes logged, not out of kindness but out of governance. Edward imprisoned Scots, Welsh rebels, and even dissenting nobles from his own court. In 1296, John Balliol, the deposed King of Scots, was held in the Tower. Though treated with courtesy, his fall was symbolic. A crowned man reduced to a guarded room, a sovereign turned captive under another's rule. This theme would repeat itself. The Tower in the reign of Edward II, a kingdom in collapse. Edward II's reign, 1307–1327, was one of instability. His open favoritism toward courtiers like Piers Gaveston and the Despensers alienated the barons. As rebellion brewed, the Tower became a revolving door for political prisoners. Those loyal to Edward one day, condemned the next. Gaveston, in particular, was detained in the Tower more than once. Though later executed by rebels in 1312 after being removed from its protection, his imprisonments exemplify the Tower's dual role, both protective and punitive. The Tower also held barons and knights caught in the shifting sands of loyalty. The lines between friend and enemy blurred. Accusations of treason were increasingly common, and a stay in the Tower often foreshadowed execution, even if formal charges were vague. But Edward's failure to maintain order eventually caught up with him. In 1326, his wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, launched a coup. Edward fled but was captured. He was imprisoned not in the Tower but elsewhere and eventually murdered. Yet his allies, the Despensers, were not so lucky. Hugh Despenser the Younger was held briefly in the Tower before being dragged to execution in a public spectacle of almost ritualized brutality. The Tower's role was clear: to contain power's casualties until the stage was ready. The Tower as royal holding pen, queens and princes in chains. Perhaps one of the most striking shifts in this period was the increased imprisonment of royal women. Queen Isabella herself, after ruling as regent for her young son Edward III, was eventually imprisoned in the Tower after her downfall in 1330. Though not subjected to execution, she was stripped of power and confined. Her captivity was comfortable but symbolic, the king's own mother silenced behind royal walls. Royal children, too, were caught in the Tower's shadow. Most hauntingly, the sons of Edward IV, later known as the Princes in the Tower, would meet their mysterious end in the Tower in the late 15th century. But even in the 14th century, the practice of holding noble or royal children as hostages or political pawns had become more formalized. The Tower became not just a prison for enemies, but a container for possibilities. The 100 Years' War and foreign captives. The outbreak of the 100 Years' War in 1337 gave the Tower a new dimension. It became a prison for foreign royalty. After the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, Edward the Black Prince captured the French king, John II of France, and brought him to England. Though initially held in the Savoy Palace, King John was later transferred to the Tower for a time. His presence there was not humiliating. He was given respect, rooms, servants, and liberty to ride and dine, but make no mistake, he was still a prisoner. This was captivity as diplomacy. John's imprisonment allowed Edward III to extract massive ransom payments and political concessions. For the Tower, it marked a peak in its international prestige. It had become not just an English tool, but a global one. To be imprisoned in the Tower meant something across Europe. The early use of torture, interrogation, emerges. By the late 14th century, the English crown began, tentatively, to use torture as an instrument of interrogation, though far less systematically than in continental Europe. The rack, believed to have been installed in the Tower during the reign of Edward III or Richard II, became a feared symbol. It was not used often, but its very presence shaped the nature of confinement. It marked a shift from waiting room to pressure chamber. Prisoners suspected of espionage, treason, or conspiracy might face questioning that blurred the line between interrogation and cruelty. Officially, torture was illegal under common law, but the king's prerogative often overrode that when the state felt threatened. Still, even in this darker incarnation, most of the Tower's violence remained psychological. The knowledge that the rack existed hidden behind a door was often enough. Silence, shadows, and the faint echo of chains did more than torture ever could. The peasants' revolt in the Tower besieged 1381. Perhaps the most shocking moment in the Tower's medieval history came not from within, but without. In June 1381, during the peasants' revolt, a mob of rebels led by Wat Tyler stormed London. Furious at oppressive taxes and local corruption, they marched to the Tower gates and were let in. How they gained entry is still debated. Some say the guards sympathized, others suggest panic or miscommunication. What's certain is that the rebels entered the Tower without resistance, a rare and terrifying moment. Inside, they found and murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and Robert Hales, the king's treasurer. Both were dragged from the Tower and beheaded on Tower Hill. This event was seismic. The Tower, thought impenetrable, had been violated. Its symbolic role as a fortress of royal justice was ruptured by the people's rage. The Crown learned a lesson. The Tower was only as powerful as the fear it projected. Reflections of control, shadows of collapse. As the 14th century drew to a close, the Tower of London stood more imposing than ever. Its walls thickened, its towers named, its role firmly cemented in royal administration. It was a prison, yes, but not of uniform purpose. It held queens and heretics, rebels and kings, children and criminals. It held not just bodies but narratives. To be in the tower was to be paused in history, waiting for judgment or absolution. But the tower also reflected the fragility of monarchy. When strong kings ruled, the tower was feared and efficient. When the court fractured, when barons rebelled or mobs swelled, its iron gates were not always enough. The tower was both stage and backstage, seen and hidden. And for those inside, the question was always the same. Would they leave as survivors or as warnings? Story 3. The mute toll of the rack, torture in the Papal Inquisition. The rack did not speak. It creaked. It whispered. It waited. It was not named in Scripture, not mentioned in the Gospels, and certainly never imagined by the apostles. And yet, by the 13th century, it had become part of the growing machinery of the Church. The Papal Inquisition, formally sanctioned and carefully structured, emerged in the early 13th century as an answer to heresy. But over the decades, it evolved into something more systematic and more chilling. In towns from Toulouse to Carcassonne, men in black robes sat in judgment, not over pagans or infidels, but over fellow Christians accused not of crimes against man, but errors against belief. Behind closed doors, the silence deepened, and sometimes that silence was broken by the creak of rope on wood, the muted toll of the rack. The origins of orthodoxy and Inquisition. The medieval church was not simply a spiritual body. It was a political power, deeply embedded in the governance of medieval Europe. By the 12th century, heresy, defined broadly as any deviation from church doctrine, was seen not only as theological error, but as rebellion. The most pressing threat came from within. Movements such as the Cathars in southern France and the Waldensians in northern Italy challenged core church teachings. They denied the sacraments, rejected church authority, and in some cases, questioned the moral legitimacy of the clergy. In response, Pope Gregory IX formalized the Inquisition in 1231. Its purpose was not to punish, but to detect and correct, to identify heretics, root out their beliefs, and return them to the fold. That was the theory. In practice, the Inquisition became a powerful bureaucracy of surveillance and fear. The courts of the Inquisition, more ink than iron at first. The early inquisitors were mostly Dominican friars, men trained in logic, rhetoric, and theology. Their tools were not chains but questions. Interrogation was an intellectual act. Suspects were summoned, asked to confess, and examined for consistency. Detailed records were kept, and judgments were made carefully, often over weeks or months. A typical inquisition began with an edict of grace, a public announcement that heretics in the area had a limited time to confess voluntarily. Those who did so were punished lightly, perhaps a pilgrimage or wearing a yellow cross on their garments. Those who refused faced inquiry. Punishments ranged from penance to imprisonment to handing over to the secular authorities for execution. The Church insisted it never shed blood, but it did not prevent others from doing so in its stead. Torture in the earliest decades was rare, not because it was forbidden, it wasn't, but because confession was preferred over coercion. The Church's goal was repentance, not martyrdom. But as the 13th century wore on, that changed. The legalization of torture, a narrow door opens. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, which officially permitted the use of torture by inquisitors under limited circumstances. The document was cautious in tone. Torture could only be used once, though the definition of once was fluid, and it had to avoid permanent harm or death. But the precedent was clear. Pain could now be a legitimate part of spiritual correction. In practice, inquisitors often followed the letter of the law carefully. They recorded sessions in detail, noted physical responses, and justified every action within the framework of ecclesiastical procedure. This was not chaotic cruelty. It was administrative suffering, an agonizing process managed with ink, parchment, and prayer. And among the tools approved for use was one of the simplest and most terrifying: the rack. The rack, simplicity in terror. The rack was not invented by the church. It had ancient origins, possibly Roman or even earlier. But by the 13th century, it had found its place in dungeons and inquisitorial chambers across Europe. The design was cruelly efficient, a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The prisoner was tied by the wrists and ankles. As the rollers turned, usually by crank or pulley, the limbs were stretched slowly and methodically. Joints dislocated, muscles tore, tendons snapped. But death was rare. The goal was pain, not execution. Inquisitors used the rack not as punishment, but as encouragement, a final push toward confession when all else failed. Records from inquisitorial proceedings sometimes describe the use of the rack in calm, procedural language. And since the accused persisted in denying the truth, he was placed upon the engine of correction and reminded of his peril. Confessions gained under torture were required to be repeated freely afterward without duress to be considered valid. This was intended as a safeguard. But for a man whose shoulders had been wrenched from their sockets, freedom was a relative concept. Case study: the Inquisition in Languedoc. Perhaps nowhere was the Papal Inquisition more active in this period than Languedoc, in southern France. The region had been a stronghold of Cathar belief, so much so that a full crusade had been launched against it in 1209. By the mid-13th century, Catharism had been driven underground, but suspicions remained. Villages like Montelou and Toulouse were closely monitored. The Inquisitor Bernard Gouy, later portrayed in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, became infamous for his work in the region. Goui's surviving register details hundreds of cases, many of them mundane, some deeply tragic. A widow who offered shelter to a traveling heretic. A shepherd who repeated a Cathar hymn overheard in childhood. A young woman who refused confession, citing her private path to God. Most were questioned, some confessed, a few were tortured. Gouy rarely used the rack himself, he preferred fear and repetition, but others in his office did. The threat of torture became almost as powerful as its application. A silence fell over the region, not the silence of conversion but of fear. The mechanics of secrecy. The torture chambers of the Inquisition were not public stages. Executions might be conducted in town squares, but interrogations were private. Cells were often small stone rooms in monasteries or repurposed castles. Witnesses were rare. Guards were sworn to secrecy. In some cases, even the accused was unaware of the identities of those testifying against them. This secrecy was not incidental, it was theological. Heresy, the church reasoned, was a disease of the soul. To cure it required privacy, introspection, and, if necessary, pressure. But this created a closed system, a world where accusations, confessions, and punishments all occurred beyond the eyes of the public. In such a system, the rack was not just a tool, it was a voice. It spoke where words failed or where silence was judged suspicious. The psychological toll. What did it mean to be accused? To sit in a stone cell for days, perhaps weeks, awaiting questioning. To hear footsteps echoing down a corridor and wonder if they were coming for you. The psychological effects of inquisitorial imprisonment were profound. Some accused collapsed under the stress without ever being tortured. Others clung to silence, even as bones cracked. And then there were those who confessed falsely, nomming friends, neighbors, even family, anything to end the questioning. Historians debate the true prevalence of torture. In some regions it was rare, in others it became routine. But in every case, the system encouraged compliance not through belief, but through exhaustion. Faith under pressure became a fragile thing. Faith and fear bound together. By 1300, the Inquisition had matured into a sprawling ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Some popes tried to limit its reach, others encouraged it, but everywhere it operated, the same themes repeated: secrecy, suspicion, and silence. The rack did not feature in every inquisition, but its specter haunted every chamber. It was the line that separated belief from betrayal, memory from confession, and silence from survival. Those who sat upon it rarely spoke of it afterward, and those who administered it recorded its use with cold precision. And so we are left with parchment, pain, and a question that echoes beyond the walls of any dungeon. Can truth survive when it is pulled from the body with rope and fear? By the start of the 14th century, the Inquisition was no longer an experiment in ecclesiastical discipline. It was a fully functioning judicial system administered by friars, guided by papal authority, and feared across towns and valleys from Aragon to Lombardy. Yet even as its procedures became increasingly codified, its moral foundation grew murkier. More inquisitors were trained, more cells were built, more voices were silenced, and behind many of these silences, the rack remained not always used but always present, a mute participant in the Church's quest for orthodoxy. This was not the loud violence of the battlefield. This was quieter, bureaucratic, and methodical, a world where the human body became a text stretched, twisted, and written upon so that its soul could be read. Torture enters the legal mainstream. The papal bull Ad Extirpanda, issued in 1252, had opened the door to the use of torture in inquisitorial trials. But in the early 1300s, that door widened. Secular rulers, particularly in northern Italy and southern France, began integrating inquisitorial methods into civic law, and in return, inquisitors increasingly leaned on civic authorities for enforcement. This created a disturbing fusion of church dogma and civic punishment, where theological error was treated like political subversion. By this time, inquisitors often traveled with notaries, assistants, and guards. Detailed records were kept, not only of confessions and testimonies, but of how the accused responded under duress. These records, often copied and stored in archives, offer us today a hauntingly clinical view of medieval pain. One such register from the Inquisitors of Toulouse includes notations such as: on the fourth turn of the cord, the accused did weep loudly and recite the Pater Noster. On being threatened with the engine of extension, the accused did reveal names of 3 others. This was no chaos of cruelty. It was structured, templated, a system. The accused, who were they? The victims of the Inquisition were rarely flamboyant preachers or rebel clerics. More often, they were ordinary people. A weaver in Montauban, who once attended a secret sermon at night. A merchant's widow who owned a book of suspicious proverbs. A shepherd accused by a jealous neighbor of holding strange opinions. These were the people brought before inquisitors. Their social rank was usually low, their education minimal. Many did not even know what heresy meant in legal terms. They had heard things, repeated things, shared food with someone who was later condemned. The accusation alone was a stain. The process was isolating. Often, the accused had no advocate. Family members might abandon them out of fear of guilt by association. In this environment, even a rumor could lead to the rack. The structure of a torture session. Despite the cruelty, inquisitorial torture was not arbitrary. It followed procedure-set steps that were recorded in judicial manuals. One such manual, Nicholas Eimerich's Directorium Inquisitorum, written later in the century but based on existing practice, laid out conditions for torture. It could be used only if the accused was strongly suspected based on testimony or circumstantial evidence. It must not endanger life or limb. It should not be repeated, although clever semantics often allowed continuation rather than repetition. A typical session proceeded as follows. Formal interrogation. The accused was asked to confess or name others. If they refused or gave inconsistent answers, the next stage began. Presentation of the instruments. The tools of torture were shown: thumbscrews, the rack, cords, possibly the strapado, a device where the victim was dropped from a height with arms bound behind. Initial coercion. Light pressure was applied. A first turn of the rack, a stretch of the arms perhaps. Progressive pain. If the accused resisted, more turns were made. Groans, screams, tears, all were documented. Confession and aftermath. If a confession was made, it had to be repeated later without torture. If retracted, the process could begin again under the guise of continuation. The mechanics were slow. No hammers, no flames. Just the human body, unknit gradually, under the watchful eye of men who believed they were saving souls. Gender, torture, and heresy. Though most inquisitorial victims were men, women were not spared. In fact, women accused of heresy were often viewed with special suspicion, especially if they lived independently, acted as healers, or showed signs of religious fervor outside church structures. In the early 14th century, the rise of female mystics, women who claimed visions, voices, or divine instruction, created a problem for ecclesiastical authorities. Some were embraced, even canonized. Others were interrogated. Torture of women followed the same general procedures as men, though often modified to avoid nudity or scandal. Some were restrained rather than stretched. Others were imprisoned in darkness for long periods, subjected to psychological rather than physical torment. A notable case is that of Beatrice de Planisoles, a noblewoman from Languedoc accused of holding Cathar beliefs. Her inquisitorial record includes extensive questioning about theology, private conversation, and her reading habits. While there is no evidence she was tortured physically, she was detained for months and pressed relentlessly. She eventually confessed, then recanted, then confessed again. Was it belief or exhaustion? In the eyes of her inquisitors, the distinction mattered little. The sounds of the Inquisition. While inquisitorial torture was largely private, its reputation was public. The mere possibility of being tortured became a kind of social control. Townspeople whispered about neighbors who disappeared into inquisitorial custody. Some reappeared with yellow crosses sewn to their tunics. Others did not return at all. The psychological toll was widespread. Even for those who never faced accusation, the silence surrounding the Inquisition was deafening. Few dared question it. Fewer still wrote openly about it. But the silence was not complete. Chroniclers like Bernard de Lucia, a Franciscan friar, openly challenged inquisitors in the early 1300s. He accused them of overreach, of cruelty, of using torture not to correct heresy but to manufacture it. For his trouble, de Lucia was arrested, interrogated, and imprisoned for life. The message was clear. The Inquisition could examine not just the body, but the questioner. Memory as punishment. Torture often left no lasting scars. Dislocated shoulders could be reset, flesh could heal, but memory remained. Survivors of the rack and other torments carried the experience in their posture, their voices, their silences. Some became zealots, repeating church doctrine with desperate precision. Others fled their towns. A few became whispering sources of resistance, telling stories to children, muttering warnings to neighbors. Inquisitors could control confessions. They could not always control memory. And yet the system persisted because it was effective not at finding truth, necessarily, but at maintaining authority. When an accused person admitted under torture that they were guilty and named others, the Inquisition grew stronger. It did not need to be just. It only needed to be feared. Instruments of pain, institutions of power. By 1350, the Inquisition had become a fixture of European religious life. Torture remained controversial but accepted. Manuals were revised, techniques recorded, legal justifications sharpened. In some towns, the rack was stored in the town hall. In others, it was kept in monastic basements, but everywhere it existed, it shared one trait. It was never meant to kill, only to convince. To convince the soul through the body, to make doubt unthinkable, to make silence the only refuge. But what happens when even silence is no longer safe? By the middle of the 14th century, the Papal Inquisition was a mature institution, efficient, feared, and embedded in the machinery of European religious life. It functioned not merely to punish heresy, but to regulate thought, confession, and community boundaries. Across southern France, northern Italy, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, the Inquisition was now a force unto itself. The rack, though used sparingly compared to common myth, had become more than an instrument. It was a symbol of fear, of silence, of an ecclesiastical system that sought not only belief but obedience. Its creaking wood, so often hidden behind cloistered walls, echoed in the minds of the faithful and the accused alike. But as Europe entered a new phase plagued by war, disease, schism, and reform, the Inquisition faced new pressures. It would not disappear, but it would change. Its future would be forged not just in stone and parchment, but in the slow unraveling of its own certainty. The Avignon Papacy and a church in fracture. Between 1309 and 1377, the seat of the papacy relocated from Rome to Avignon, a period often called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. During this time, the Church's moral authority was widely questioned. Its alliances with secular rulers, particularly in France, caused resentment. Inquisitors, once trusted agents of the papacy, now found themselves operating in a more divided and skeptical landscape. The Black Death, 1347–1351, added to this erosion. Entire villages were wiped out. Clergy died in droves, and in the aftermath, new movements arose: flagellants, mystics, radical preachers, all outside the neat categories of sanctioned faith. The Inquisition tried to adapt, but the old tools, interrogation, excommunication, the rack, could not answer all the new questions. Heresy was changing, becoming less institutional and more personal. And so, inquisitors turned inward. The rack and the intellectuals. A curious shift occurred in the later 14th and 15th centuries. The targets of inquisitorial torture increasingly included scholars, theologians, and mystics. Some of these were sincere reformers. Others were academic critics of church corruption. Many were women and men who claimed private revelations or mystical experiences, visions of Christ, ecstatic states, or interior illumination. Examples include Marguerite Porete, a Beguine mystic whose book The Mirror of Simple Souls was condemned for promoting a form of spiritual freedom that bypassed the church. She was burned at the stake in 1310 in Paris after years of silence under interrogation. While the specific use of torture is unclear, her long detainment reflects the church's anxiety toward inner, unmediated experience. Girolamo Savonarola, the fiery preacher of Florence, who railed against church corruption in the 1490s. He was tortured on the rack in 1498 before being executed. His confession was extracted through severe stretching, though even under such duress, he maintained partial resistance. These cases reflect a new anxiety, not simply about external heresies like Catharism, but internal threats, those who questioned authority from within the church's intellectual framework. In such cases, torture became both a judicial tool and a theological weapon, an attempt to wrest truth from nuance, complexity from paradox. Spain and the shadow of what's to come. As the Papal Inquisition began to wane in parts of Europe, a new, more centralized and brutal version was rising elsewhere. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, was initially approved by Pope Sixtus IV, but quickly became a state-run institution. Its targets were not primarily Protestants or mystics, but conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity and were suspected of secretly continuing Jewish practices. In Spain, torture became far more systematic and institutionalized. The rack was one of several devices used, alongside the stripado, the garrocha, and various tools of crushing or burning. Confessions were meticulously recorded, extracted over multiple sessions, and sometimes published as cautionary tales. Unlike the earlier Papal Inquisition, which at least nominally sought repentance, the Spanish model was more focused on uniformity and control, often regardless of actual belief. Torture, once reluctantly tolerated, was now codified into the system. Though the Spanish Inquisition falls slightly beyond the main period of the Papal Inquisition's medieval phase, its rise was foreshadowed by centuries of procedural torture and religious policing. And the rack, already a symbol of ecclesiastical pressure, would reach new levels of notoriety. The decline of the rack and rise of other methods. By the late 15th century, some regions began to abandon the use of the rack, not out of mercy, but due to changing philosophies of evidence and punishment. Legal scholars, influenced by Roman law, began advocating for a return to rational inquiry. Some courts concluded that torture was unreliable, that under enough pain, any confession could be secured, making it meaningless. Others were concerned with the scandal torture generated. Secret prisons and quiet confessions were preferable. Quiet imprisonment without public torture became the favored method of silencing dissent. Thus, the rack, though never widespread in use compared to its reputation, became obsolete in many regions. It remained in stories, rumors, and court records, but its utility faded. The Inquisition, too, would shift. It would persist into the modern era, into the Reformation, the Enlightenment, even the early modern colonial period, but increasingly it did so with different tools: censors, secret denunciations, and psychological coercion. The age of wooden frames and pulled limbs was giving way to subtler forms of control. Remembering the unremembered. Today, the rack is often misunderstood. It looms large in popular imagination, but historians are quick to note it was not used on the scale often claimed. Not every accused heretic was tortured. Not every confession was extracted through pain. Yet the power of the rack lies not in numbers, but in silence. It represented a world where the body was a path to the soul, where the church believed it had the right, perhaps even the duty, to manipulate flesh to preserve doctrine. The records are filled with names: artisans, widows, shepherds, scholars. Some recanted, others resisted, many were broken. Their voices, where preserved, are fragmentary. A line in Latin here, a trembling sentence there. Often, we know more about their bones than their thoughts. But in that silence, we hear a story not of pain alone, but of institutional certainty imposed on human uncertainty. The final creak of the crank. As the Middle Ages ended, so too did the idea that faith could be enforced with instruments of pain. The Reformation would challenge the authority of the Church directly. The Enlightenment would question the very nature of truth, belief, and governance. The Inquisition survived, but the rack, that mute engine of confessions, became a relic. It sits now in museums, posed beneath dim lighting. Visitors stare, some in morbid fascination, others in disbelief. But the real story is not the wood or the iron. It is the world that made it necessary. A world where salvation could be forced, where belief could be measured in stretched sinews, where silence was not just the absence of sound but the residue of crushed resistance. And as we step away from the echo of that final turn, we are left to wonder. What truths are lost forever when faith is written on the body, rather than the soul? Story 4. locked in the castle noble captives in feudal disputes. In the tapestry of medieval life, war was not always fought for conquest. Often, it was waged for leverage. In the feudal world, where titles, land, and honor formed a delicate hierarchy of mutual obligation, a battle did not necessarily end with a death. It might instead end with a deal. And at the center of these deals was a particular kind of prisoner, the noble captive. Locked not in filthy cells but in castle towers and stone chambers, these men knights, lords, even princes were currency. They were bargaining chips in the long chess game of feudal diplomacy. And though their chains were often metaphorical, their captivity was real, and its consequences reached across borders and generations. This was not the captivity of cruelty. It was the captivity of politics, of ransom, and of the intricate code of honor that governed the ruling classes of medieval Europe. The norms of noble warfare. In the 12th and early 13th centuries, Europe was a patchwork of territories governed by dukes, counts, barons, and kings, many of whom owed allegiance to one another, but also maintained their own rivalries. Feudal conflicts were often limited in scale, small skirmishes, border raids, and castle sieges rather than large set-piece battles. Within this world, capturing a noble enemy alive was often more valuable than killing him. A dead baron offered nothing, but a live one, he could be ransomed. This custom, well established by the 1100s, was part of the law of arms, a code of conduct among knights and aristocrats that governed how prisoners were to be taken, treated, and eventually released. It reflected not mercy, but economic realism. A captured noble might fetch thousands of marks more than the annual income of many minor lords. His ransom could buy loyalty, pay debts, or fund a new campaign. And so, battles became as much about who was captured as who won. The capture of King Stephen, 1141. One of the most dramatic examples of noble captivity occurred during the civil war known as the Anarchy, 1135–1154. When King Stephen of England was captured at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141. Stephen was not a minor noble, he was a reigning monarch. His capture by forces loyal to Empress Matilda upended the political balance of the realm. But even in this extreme case, Stephen was not thrown into a dungeon. He was detained at Bristol Castle, housed in relative comfort. Why? Because Matilda could not kill him, not without appearing tyrannical. Instead, she sought to use him as leverage to secure her claim to the throne. Stephen's imprisonment lasted months, during which Matilda advanced on London and had herself declared Lady of the English. But public support wavered. Later that same year, Matilda's most powerful supporter, Robert of Gloucester, was captured in turn, and a prisoner exchange was arranged. Stephen was freed. The war resumed. No one had died in chains, but the balance of power had shifted twice. This was the pattern. Captivity as honor, not shame. Unlike common criminals, noble prisoners were not stigmatized by their capture. Quite the opposite. To be taken prisoner in battle was often seen as a mark of valor, especially if one had fought bravely before yielding. Captives were typically treated according to their rank. A baron might be lodged in a castle chamber with access to servants and wine. He was expected to maintain dignity, pay his own expenses, and eventually negotiate or arrange a ransom. In some cases, captives were even permitted to ride freely within the castle walls or go on supervised hunts. The arrangement was understood by both captor and captive. There was no Geneva Convention, yet there was a shared cultural understanding that preserving the life and dignity of a noble prisoner was good business. To violate that understanding, to mistreat or kill a high-ranking captive, was to court disaster. Reputations were damaged. Revenge was certain. Honor demanded a certain civility. The economics of ransom. Ransoms were structured with surprising complexity. The amount owed was calculated based on the captive's rank, wealth, and political value. Negotiations were often protracted, involving family members, overlords, and intermediaries. Hostages might be exchanged temporarily to ensure payment. Land might be ceded in lieu of money. Promises of loyalty or marriage alliances might be included in the deal. Payments were sometimes made in installments. In other cases, captives were released on parole, vowing to return if the ransom was not met, a vow often honored. Such was the strength of the chivalric code. The Chanson de Roland, a famous epic poem, even romanticizes the practice, with knights refusing escape or rescue if it would dishonor their oath. The system, for all its violence, was deeply regulated by trust. Notable captivities: Richard the Lionheart, 1192–1194. The most famous noble captivity of the era involved King Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart. Returning from the Third Crusade in 1192, Richard was shipwrecked and forced to travel through the territory of Leopold V of Austria, with whom he had quarreled during the crusade. He was recognized in disguise, captured, and sold to Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom, 150,000 marks, roughly 3 times England's annual income. Richard was held at Duenstein Castle and later in other imperial fortresses. He was not tortured or humiliated, rather. His captors treated him with the caution due to a king who might one day be free. Back in England, a massive tax known as the Aid of the King's Ransom was levied. Subjects across the realm, from barons to peasants, contributed. Eventually, the ransom was paid, and Richard returned restored to power, his legend enhanced. His captivity had not weakened him. It had, in a way, glorified him. Imprisonment during feudal sieges. While famous battles produced famous captives, most noble imprisonments occurred during local feuds and sieges. When one lord besieged another's castle and forced its surrender, the garrison might be spared, but the lord himself was often taken. He would be held in the very same castle he had once commanded, now a guest prisoner in his own hall. These captives were sometimes forced to sign charters, cede land, or recognize feudal inferiority before being released. Again, the goal was not suffering, it was submission. Yet captivity was not without risk. If a captive's family failed to raise ransom, or if the political winds shifted, he might linger in confinement for years. Though his quarters were not squalid, the uncertainty of fate was its own form of torment. The role of castles in confinement. Castles were not designed as prisons, but their tower chambers, gatehouses, and secluded halls made them ideal for holding important captives. Few castles had dedicated dungeons in the modern sense. Cells were adapted from storerooms or guest chambers. Security varied. Some prisoners were shackled, others were trusted. Guards were usually local retainers, loyal to the lord who held the captive. And though escapes did occur, they were rare. The cost of betrayal was high, and the consequences for a fugitive noble could be catastrophic: loss of land, excommunication, or death. Thus most noble captives waited, they negotiated, they played the long game. Captivity was not defeat. It was a pause in the feudal rhythm, a costly, dangerous, and often necessary one. Between battle and bargain. By 1250, the practice of capturing and ransoming nobles had become so entrenched that entire careers were built upon it. Some knights entered battle less concerned with victory than with the prospect of capturing a wealthy foe. Indeed, tournaments, a formalized version of battle, often simulated captivity and ransom as part of the game. This was a culture that valued leverage over death, where the chainmail was not only for protection, but for investment. But beneath the honor and pageantry was a quiet truth. Captivity, even for nobles, was still captivity. And as politics grew more brutal and centralized in the centuries to come, the rules of this delicate system would fray. Soon, castles would no longer be holding cells of diplomacy but sites of suspicion, surveillance, and state punishment. But before that turning point came, one must ask, what happens when honor no longer protects the captured, when power outweighs ransom, and kings begin to fear even their own lords? By the middle of the 13th century, the golden age of the noble captive, where ransom was a right of honor and imprisonment, a courteous negotiation began to strain under the weight of political change. Feudalism was still the fabric of medieval society, but the stitching had started to fray. Kings were growing stronger, barons more anxious, and warfare more intense. No longer just small-scale border feuds, conflicts were becoming regional, dynastic, and ideologically charged. With this change came a subtle but profound shift in the nature of captivity. The castle chamber that once served as a polite holding cell began to take on a colder, more pragmatic tone. The language of honor persisted, but it was increasingly spoken through gritted teeth. The erosion of the chivalric contract. The idea of ransomable warfare, where battles concluded in profitable captivity, rather than bloodshed, depended on shared cultural values among the nobility. But such shared assumptions required trust. That trust began to erode in the 13th century, particularly as monarchs sought to consolidate power at the expense of the traditional baronial class. Rulers like Louis IX of France, Edward I of England, and Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire increasingly treated rebellious nobles not as peers in a shared system of honor, but as criminal threats to centralized authority. Captured barons might still be ransomed, but more often now, they were imprisoned indefinitely, stripped of lands, and judged in royal court settings where chivalric codes held little sway. In short, politics was replacing honor. Edward I and the conquest of Wales, noble captivity as strategy. A sharp illustration of this shift can be found in the actions of Edward I during the English conquest of Wales in the late 13th century. When Dafydd ap Griffith, the brother of the Prince of Wales, turned on the English crown in 1282, Edward responded with full military force. Dafydd was captured in 1283, not treated as a highborn enemy, but as a traitor. He was imprisoned briefly, then executed in a brutal public ritual, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His family members, including children, were imprisoned in royal castles, some for life. These were not ransoms. There were no negotiations. This was punitive imprisonment designed to break dynasties. Even the female members of the Welsh nobility were not spared. Dafydd's daughters were confined to nunneries under strict conditions, a quiet captivity that robbed them not just of freedom, but of future political relevance. In this model, the noble captive was no longer a bargaining chip, but a threat to be neutralized. Castle prisons and the politics of permanent confinement. During this period, more castles began to include dedicated prison spaces, secure rooms, barred windows, sometimes chains fixed into the walls. The idea of keeping noble captives not for ransom, but for control, had taken hold. This was especially true during civil unrest or disputes between a king and his powerful barons. One famous example comes from Scotland, where King John Balliol, after being dethroned by Edward I in 1296, was held for 3 years in various English castles, including the Tower of London. Though technically a king, Balliol was treated as a royal detainee, his movements restricted, his political influence nullified. Eventually, he was allowed to retire to France, but not until Edward had ensured that Balliol's presence in Britain would no longer pose a threat. Here we see the emergence of a new model, permanent political captivity. These prisoners were not ransomed. They were not executed. They were absorbed, held quietly, away from public life, until their usefulness ended or their threat diminished. The Barons' Wars. Trust breaks down in England. The Barons' Wars of the mid-13th century, particularly the rebellion of Simon de Montfort against King Henry III, further exposed the limits of noble solidarity. When de Montfort was killed at the Battle of Evesham, 1265, his followers were not ransomed in the traditional fashion. Many were imprisoned without trial, their lands confiscated by the crown. The usual expectations of knightly treatment were ignored. De Montfort's sons Simon and Guy fled to France, while others were held in Rochester or Windsor. These were not brief detainments. Some lingered in custody for years, their properties and titles permanently lost. In the past, such captives might have negotiated a return to power, but in the new political climate, loyalty had to be absolute. Disloyal nobles were no longer valuable, they were liabilities. Even the ransom system began to falter. The crown often refused to honor ransom agreements made between barons, asserting its monopoly over justice and warfare. This undermined the chivalric market of captivity. The game had changed. The capture of Robert the Bruce's family, 1306–1314. When Robert the Bruce declared himself King of Scots in 1306, Edward I responded with overwhelming force. Bruce's male allies were executed. His female relatives, including his sister, daughter, and wife, were captured. The women were not ransomed. They were held in English castles, confined under harsh conditions. Elizabeth de Bourgh, Bruce's wife, was held at various locations, including Windsor. Marjorie Bruce, his daughter, was imprisoned in the Tower. Christina Bruce, his sister, was kept under close watch. Perhaps most famously, Isabella Macduff, who had crowned Bruce at Scone, was imprisoned in a cage hung from the walls of Berwick Castle, exposed to the elements and public view, a living warning. This was captivity as humiliation, not negotiation. No ransom was offered. No terms discussed. These were royal hostages, kept alive but powerless tools in a larger campaign to erase a rebellion's legitimacy. It marked a grim turn in the history of noble captivity, when bloodlines became weapons, and imprisonment was as symbolic as it was strategic. From courtesy to caution. Despite these changes, not all noble captives were treated harshly. Some kings, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, continued to observe chivalric customs. But even in those regions, caution grew. Noble prisoners were kept longer. Larger ransoms were demanded. Strict oaths were required before release, vows never to take up arms again, or to relinquish land claims. If broken, the penalty was not simply a return to prison but death. Thus, the line between prisoner and traitor narrowed. Castles, once polite holding pens, became places of long silences. And in those silences, the old world of feudal balance slipped further into history. The beginning of the end for chivalric captivity. By the early 14th century, the age of knightly ransom and honor-bound imprisonment had begun to pass. The rise of professional armies, standing courts, and centralized monarchies altered the calculus of warfare. Nobles were no longer independent actors in regional disputes, they were instruments of the state. And the state had no need for independent brokers of war. The noble captive had become an inconvenience. It would take the 100 years, war to briefly revive the chivalric model of capture and ransom. But even then, the system was now saturated with suspicion, exploited by politics, and redefined by bureaucracy. No longer just a matter of honor, imprisonment had become part of statecraft. And if the rules could shift so easily for nobles, what did that mean for those below them? As Europe stumbled into the late medieval period, the long-standing customs of noble captivity began to buckle under the weight of total war, economic strain, and state ambition. Between the devastation of the Black Death, The eruption of dynastic conflicts like the Hundred Years' War and the rising tide of centralized monarchies, the very idea of a gentleman's imprisonment began to fade. Yet paradoxically, this was also the golden age of ransom. From the battlefields of Poitiers to the towers of Vincennes, noble captives were more visible than ever, paraded through cities, documented in treaties and accounted for in ledgers. But now, they were not only pawns in aristocratic games. They were symbols of sovereignty, prestige, and the fragile economics of chivalric warfare. And increasingly, their chains were less about honor and more about leverage. The Hundred Years' War, captivity at scale. The Hundred Years' War, 1337–1453, a sprawling and intermittent conflict between England and France, redefined the nature of noble captivity. Gone were the days of localized skirmishes and castle sieges over feudal disagreements. This was now a national war, fought with professional armies and driven by dynastic claims. And with larger battles came larger captures. Two pivotal moments demonstrate how captivity functioned at scale. 1. The Battle of Poitiers, 1356, the King in Chains. At Poitiers, the English under Edward, the Black Prince, defeated a much larger French force and captured none other than King John II of France. A reigning monarch taken in battle again. But unlike King Stephen's capture 2 centuries earlier, this event took place within a fully developed culture of diplomatic ransom. King John was held in relative luxury, first in Bordeaux, then later in England. He was not tortured, degraded, or hidden. In fact, his captivity became a public spectacle. He was treated as a guest king, with great expense and ceremony, in part because of his rank, and in part because the English crown hoped to extract an enormous ransom. The Treaty of Bretagne, 1360, set the ransom at 3 million écus, one of the largest financial agreements in medieval history. France was also required to cede territory to the English crown. And yet, despite all the formality, John's captivity exposed a growing contradiction. Honor could be commodified, and kingship itself became something to be priced. He was eventually released, but when the terms of the treaty were not fulfilled, payments delayed, territory disputed, John voluntarily returned to captivity in England to honor his word. He died in London in 1364. Honor, yes, but in a cage nonetheless. 2. Captivity as industry. The scale of the Poitiers capture encouraged something new: the professionalization of ransom. Knights and captains began entering battle not simply to fight for king or country, but with the specific aim of capturing wealthy foes. Noble prisoners became a source of personal income. The ransom system was now so deeply embedded that it sustained entire military careers. Ransom was taxed, recorded, and even used as collateral. Prisoners sometimes borrowed from merchants to pay their way out of confinement, creating an economy of chivalric debt. The more valuable the prisoner, the more delicately they were treated. Yet this also created tension. What of those who could not pay, or those whose loyalty was suspect? And what happens when the concept of honor breaks down entirely? The problem of the unransomable. Not all noble captives had such predictable fates. Mercenaries, for example, had no guarantee of ransom. Despite noble blood, their status as paid soldiers made their captors suspicious. Foreign nobles from minor principalities were often held for years if no one could or would pay. Their captivity became permanent exile, with letters pleading for release ignored by kings more concerned with higher prizes. Political prisoners, those captured not in open battle but through betrayal, or who posed a threat to dynastic claims, were increasingly excluded from the chivalric economy. One grim example is Charles of Navarre, a French noble with competing royal claims, who was imprisoned multiple times in both France and Normandy between the 1350s and 1370s. His releases were conditional, political, and his imprisonments more punitive than procedural. In such cases, honor gave way to calculation. Captivity was not just a temporary state, it became a tool of neutralization. Captives in castles and townhouses. By this period, noble captives were no longer confined only in austere towers. In England, France, and Burgundy, they might be lodged in manorial houses under guard, especially if of higher rank, monasteries for religious nobles or clerics, townhouses in London or Paris, where surveillance was easier and where their presence could impress or intimidate visiting envoys. This form of honorable detention allowed for both visibility and control. A captive duke might attend court under guard, or dine with a monarch always as a guest prisoner, free in body but not in will. But even in these well-appointed confinements, the stress was real. Letters from noble prisoners during this period reflect exhaustion, humiliation, and deep frustration at the political games in which they were pawns. Some grew ill, others simply disappeared into the administrative fog. Women in captivity. Noblewomen, too, were increasingly used as hostages and captives during this period. Their fates, though less visible, were no less significant. Yolande of Aragon, captured in the late 14th century, was held for several years in a carefully controlled environment. Her release was tied not only to money, but to marriage alliances. The daughters of defeated nobles were frequently confined to nunneries, often for life not as penance, but as preventative exile, ensuring they could not marry or produce heirs that might lay claim to contested titles. Women were rarely ransomed in their own right, but their bodies and status became extensions of diplomacy negotiated over, exchanged, or silenced as the political winds required. The seeds of change, warfare without rules. The late 14th and early 15th centuries saw a gradual shift in warfare from feudal conflicts to early national wars. This brought consequences for the noble prisoner. During the English campaigns under Henry V, culminating in the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, the king famously ordered the execution of French prisoners during the heat of battle. These were not common footmen but knights and nobles, whose lives under chivalric custom should have been preserved for ransom. But Henry feared a renewed assault and could not risk rear action from his captives. The code of honor had its limits. The act scandalized some chroniclers, but it also demonstrated a grim truth: captivity was no longer sacred. And after the French resurgence under Joan of Arc, the nature of noble warfare began to shift further. Joan herself, though a peasant, was tried like a noble, detained under harsh but structured conditions, and executed by secular authorities with ecclesiastical permission. Her case blurred every line: faith, politics, gender, and imprisonment, and it revealed that the old codes based on bloodlines and battlefield conduct no longer applied cleanly in a world driven by ideology and central power. From captivity to confinement, a final thought. By 1450, the notion of the noble captive as a temporary but respected adversary was rapidly dying. Nobles could still be captured, of course. Ransoms were still paid, but more often prisoners were judged in court, detained for years, or quietly eliminated. As royal bureaucracies grew and military service became professionalized, the personal, courteous nature of captivity gave way to something else: state detention. No longer managed by fellow nobles, prisoners were now at the mercy of clerks, constables, and crowns. Castle dungeons, once occasional stops, became longer residences. Political suspects were not ransomed but investigated. And if nobles were no longer guaranteed dignity, in chains, what hope was left for anyone else? When castles become cages and ransom becomes silence, who is left to remember the rules that once governed mercy in war. Story 5. The Forgotten Captive Life in a Crusader Dungeon. The sun over the Levant was unrelenting, too bright for dreams, too hot for mercy. Yet beneath the blistering stones of Crusader fortresses and Ayyubid citadels alike, men were held in darkness. They were knights, squires, pilgrims, and sometimes peasants who had followed banners too far from home. Most bore crosses on their shoulders or tunics. Now they bore only chains. These captives were not the noble hostages of European feuds, held in castle towers awaiting ransom. They were prisoners of holy war, taken during the Crusades, and buried in a world that had little room for negotiation, and even less for remembrance. Some would be ransomed, others would vanish, a few would convert, many would simply die slowly, quietly, in cells carved into sandstone and seared by silence. This is the story of one such world, a place not of banners and glory, but of thirst, time, and waiting. The Fall of the Cross at Hattin, 1187. To understand the lives of these forgotten captives, one must begin with a battle. Hattin, fought in July 1187 near the Sea of Galilee. It was a turning point in the Crusades, an utter disaster for the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Led by Guy of Lusignan, the Crusader army was lured into open, arid terrain by Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. With their water supplies cut and the sun draining their strength, the Christian forces collapsed. Saladin's forces captured thousands. Among them were high-ranking nobles Guy himself, Reynold of Chatillon, the Templars and Hospitallers. But not all were equal in captivity. Guy of Lusignan was treated with honor, given shade, and eventually released. Reynold, infamous for brutal raids on Muslim caravans, was executed by Saladin himself. Knights Templar and Hospitaller leaders known for refusing to ransom or convert were beheaded by the hundreds, seen as fanatics unworthy of compromise. The rank-and-file crusaders. They were taken to prison camps, distributed as laborers, or sold as slaves across Syria, Egypt, and the wider Islamic world. These are the men whose stories vanish in parchment, but their shadows remain. Captured in a foreign land. Imagine the moment of capture. A crusader knight, perhaps not wealthy, perhaps a younger son seeking fame, taken in the desert. His armor stripped, his mouth parched, his future uncertain. Perhaps he is marched to Damascus, Aleppo, or Cairo. Perhaps he is sold to a private household. Perhaps he is placed in a citadel to labor or await ransom that will never come. The prisons used for such captives varied. Citadel dungeons, deep chambers beneath fortresses like Aleppo or Cairo, often carved directly into the stone. No light, little food, meant to isolate and exhaust. Caravanserai cells, used for temporary holding of prisoners, particularly if they were to be moved or displayed. Private captivity. Some prisoners were handed over to nobles or military commanders as servants or laborers. Captivity was not uniform, but it was consistently disorienting. Few captives spoke Arabic. Many had never left their homeland. The culture, the climate, and the silence were a second set of chains. What did captivity look like? Contrary to popular imagination, Crusader captives were not always chained in dungeons. Some were forced into labor, such as repairing fortresses, digging wells, or working in galleys. Used as leverage, held in exchange for Muslim prisoners in Christian hands. Converted, often under pressure, occasionally by choice. Sold into slavery, particularly if they were not knights or lacked powerful connections. For knights and nobles, the prospect of ransom existed, but it depended entirely on their ability to reach relatives in Europe or on the interest of military orders like the Templars or Hospitallers to intervene. But for common soldiers and pilgrims, they were often forgotten. Their names were never recorded. They became property, folded into a system that did not view them as warriors but as resources. Some worked in the very places they had once tried to conquer, now quarrying stone for the reconstruction of castles they had failed to take. Religious conversion and cultural drift. A subset of Crusader prisoners converted to Islam. Some did so under pressure. Others found a kind of peace in the ritual regularity of Islamic life. A few became translators, scribes, or even soldiers in Muslim armies known as renegades in Christian chronicles. For example, Arabic sources occasionally mention Frankish Muslims, who had learned Arabic, taken Muslim names, and served as mercenaries or guards. These men lived between worlds. In Christian Europe, they were seen as apostates. In the Islamic world, they were tools tolerated but not fully trusted. One such individual, Theobald the Renegade, appears in obscure records as a crusader who joined Saladin's forces and fought at Acre. His fate, like many, fades after a few entries in conflicting chronicles. But the existence of such figures suggests that captivity was not always a terminus. Sometimes it was a crossroads. Letters never answered, ransom and silence. Efforts were made to ransom captives. Monastic orders, such as the Order of Mercy, Mercedarians, and Trinitarians, were founded specifically to negotiate for and redeem Christian prisoners in Muslim lands. They traveled with funds, letters, and sometimes risks to their own lives. But these efforts were selective. Only those of status or with patrons had a realistic chance of release. For every successful ransom, there were dozens of letters that went unanswered or never sent at all. Europe was far. Politics at home could move on quickly. A captive in Tyre might wait 5 years, then 10, only to realize no one was coming. Food was rationed, disease was common, hope became its own kind of torment. A prisoner might die within a year, or linger for decades changing languages, losing the prayers of his youth, and becoming a ghost of the crusade he once believed in. Archaeology of captivity. Very few physical traces of Crusader captivity remain. Prisons were repurposed or destroyed. Chains were recycled. Names were lost. But archaeologists in Syria and Israel have uncovered graffiti scratched into stone crosses, names, ships perhaps made by prisoners during long nights in dungeon corners. One such site near Safed, an important Templar stronghold, revealed faint carvings likely made by Christian captives forgotten until rediscovered in the 20th century. These were not declarations. They were memories etched in stone, signs that someone once had waited here. Someone who had not been ransomed. Someone who was not returned. Cultural memories and erasure. The stories of these captives rarely made it into the great epics. The Chanson de Roland, the Gesta Francorum, the Chronicles of William of Tyre, they all speak of glorious battles, of martyrdom, of victory and betrayal. But they do not linger long in the shadows of the prison cell. Even Muslim chroniclers, such as Ibn al-Athir, mention prisoners only briefly as statistics, or objects in treaty exchanges. These men, tens of thousands over 2 centuries, became background figures in a narrative shaped by kings and commanders. Yet their presence was real, their suffering long, their identities blurred. In the end, they formed a silent chorus, one that echoes through the edges of parchment, in the margins of scrolls, and in the stonework beneath ruined keeps. A question beneath the sand. As the Third Crusade loomed, and Richard the Lionheart approached the Levant with fresh armies, rumors spread of prisoners held in the dungeons of Acre, Tyre, and Damascus. Did they hope for liberation? Did they still pray in Latin? Did they recognize the lands they once sought to claim? Or had they become something else, neither conquerors nor conquered, but remnants of a war that never truly ended? They do not answer. They never could. But they leave behind a question, buried beneath layers of stone and silence. What does it mean to fight for a holy land, only to vanish into it, unnamed, unseen, and unreturned? The rush of battle fades quickly. The clang of swords, the dust kicked up by horses, the panic of retreat, all of it vanishes within days. What remains for the captured, however, is something slower, more enduring. It is the routine of captivity. A pattern of hours no longer governed by duty or faith, but by confinement. For the thousands of prisoners taken during the Crusades, those whose names were never recorded, and whose chains rusted in silence, their days unfolded with grim consistency. And while high-ranking nobles were ransomed or exchanged, most captive soldiers, servants, pilgrims entered a life measured not by hope, but by survival. This section explores what life may have looked like for those long-forgotten captives. The food they ate, the work they performed, the faith they clung to or surrendered, and how, over years, they slowly disappeared from the world they once knew. Prison as a place, not a sentence. In the medieval Islamic world, prisons were not uniform structures. There was no single model for incarceration. Instead, prisoners of war, especially crusaders, could be found in various places. Military citadels, cells beneath fortresses like Damascus or Aleppo, housed important captives or groups of prisoners en route to other cities. Private households. Some captives were gifted or sold to wealthy nobles who used them as laborers, grooms, or status symbols. Religious endowments, waqf. Occasionally, captives were placed under the care of religious institutions, performing maintenance or labor in exchange for basic sustenance. In many cases, there was no sentence length. A man might expect release when ransomed, but if that ransom never came, he remained indefinitely. Months became years. The cell became a home in miniature. There was little ceremony in their confinement. No judgments read, no public declarations, just an iron ring in the wall, perhaps, and a mat on the floor. Labor and life. While elite prisoners might be allowed a passive confinement, most ordinary captives were expected to work. This labor varied depending on skill, strength, and the needs of the captor. Masonry and construction. Many captives were forced to work on the very walls of castles or cities they had once tried to breach. Their familiarity with siegecraft made them valuable. Port labor. In cities like Acre or Tyre under Muslim control, prisoners helped unload ships or build docks. Agricultural work. Those held in rural areas were used as field hands, planting, harvesting, digging irrigation channels. Galley slavery. Though more common later, some were chained as rowers in merchant or military vessels. Disease, injury, and drowning were constant threats. Laborers were often chained together, not to prevent escape, they were too far from home for that, but to prevent fighting and foster interdependence. Food was minimal: coarse bread, water, perhaps some lentils or dates. A rare meat stew might arrive during Ramadan or festivals, offered as charity or display. There was no privacy, no clock, only the rhythm of the overseer's shout, the roll of the sun, and the long, grinding echo of time. Language and isolation. Most Western captives spoke no Arabic, and in the early years of captivity, this deepened the disorientation. But over time, language seeped in. A few learned enough to understand orders. Others began to speak rudimentary phrases, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes as a survival instinct. Some were placed with other prisoners who acted as interpreters, often captives who had been there for years. These men held strange authority, not quite free, not quite prisoners. They had adapted, learned the rhythms, and served as intermediaries between captives and captors. They were also resented, sometimes feared. For newer prisoners, hearing a fellow Frank speak Arabic was jarring evidence that the walls were not just stone, but cultural. Over time, it became harder to remember the sounds of home. Faith in a hostile landscape. Faith was one of the few things captives could carry, but even this became complex. Christian captives were generally allowed to pray privately, though public displays like mass or processions were often forbidden. Some captives improvised altars with stones or etched crosses into walls. Others carried small reliquaries, hidden trinkets from Jerusalem, or the bones of saints. But the pressure to convert was real. Islamic law permitted the enslavement of captured unbelievers, but encouraged manumission release upon conversion. This made religious conversion a gateway to freedom for many captives. Some accepted, others refused, clinging to the rhythms of Latin prayer whispered under breath. Still, conversion was rarely dramatic. It often came quietly after years of isolation, after friendships formed with guards, after a captive took on Arabic clothing and language. Some converts were sincere, others were strategic. Either way, their new identity was rarely accepted in Europe if they ever returned. They were forgotten, or worse, branded traitors. Letters that never arrived. If a captive had family or connections back in Europe, he might attempt to send letters written by a scribe, translated into Arabic, then sent through intermediaries. But these chains of communication were fragile. Monastic ransom orders, like the Mercedarians or Trinitarians, relied on safe passage through dangerous terrain. Payments could be intercepted. Rivalries between Christian kingdoms or papal politics might delay or derail negotiations. A single letter might take months to reach Europe if it ever arrived, and the response, assuming anyone was able or willing to act, could take longer still. Many captives wrote once, waited years, and gave up. Some never wrote at all. They came to believe, often rightly, that they had been forgotten. The psychology of endless captivity. Captivity erodes the sense of self not through force, but through repetition. Each day looks like the last. Each sunrise brings the same food, the same commands, the same silences. Over time, the prisoner begins to forget why he came. He forgets the name of his home village. He forgets how to speak without fear. There are accounts, not many, but enough, of captives who, upon being released, refused to leave or panicked when brought to ships bound for Europe. Others, when returned to their homeland, were unable to reintegrate. They had changed too much. Some could no longer speak their native tongue. Others had married into Muslim families, taken new names, or found a kind of peace in a life that, while confined, was familiar. They were free, but only in name. Rare returns. When captives were ransomed or released, it was often under negotiated truces or mass prisoner exchanges. One such example occurred after the siege of Damietta, 1218–1219, during the Fifth Crusade, when Muslim and Christian forces arranged a swap of prisoners following a stalemate. These arrangements were often fraught. Lists had to be verified, oaths sworn. Captives returning from years of imprisonment were paraded through cities, celebrated as survivors, but many were older, broken, and sick. They had missed entire wars. Their families had moved on. Some had no one left at all. They became curiosities or burdens. A few retired into monastic life. Others disappeared again, this time into Europe's quieter margins. A final glimpse. One chronicler, Oliver of Paderborn, writing about the Fifth Crusade, mentions in passing a captive, whose beard had grown so long he no longer remembered his age, nor the sound of church bells. No name is given, just that he was released, wandered the camp, and wept when he heard Latin spoken aloud. That single moment tells us more than pages of military triumphs. It tells us what it meant to be held not in iron, but in memory's absence. To be forgotten, even as you remember everything. To be alive, yet nowhere. And to find, in your release, that the world you longed for has also moved on without you. By the end of the 13th century, the Crusader states in the Levant had begun to collapse, one stronghold at a time. Acre, once the bustling capital of Latin Christendom in the East, fell in 1291. With its fall, the final chapter of the Christian military presence in the Holy Land was written in fire and blood. But even as the armies sailed home, burning ships and scattering relics, some remained. Not by choice, but because they had never left. They were the forgotten captives of earlier crusades, prisoners of battles long faded from record, of sieges no longer sung about in Europe's monasteries. They had entered the Holy Land with banners and vows. They stayed behind in chains, silence, and obscurity. This final section explores their legacy not in military triumph or noble lineage, but in the invisible imprint they left on history. In the blurred borders of identity, in the endurance of belief and compromise, and in the quiet evolution from crusader to captive to something else entirely. The final captives of the Levant. After the loss of Acre in 1291, the flow of new captives all but ceased. The last major crusading effort to reach the Levant was the Ninth Crusade, 1271–1272, led by the future King Edward I of England. Though minor in scale, it still ended in battles, raids, and prisoners. But this time, the fates of captives were more ambiguous. Muslim leaders such as the Mamluks, particularly under Sultan Baybars, were less inclined to follow the old rituals of ransom and exchange. Baybars was a man of war, a former slave turned general, then sultan. He saw no reason to grant dignity to those he deemed religious enemies. When he captured Antioch in 1268, he reportedly executed thousands and enslaved many more. The practice of noble courtesy toward prisoners, so carefully maintained in earlier decades, had begun to erode entirely. Captives were now instruments of humiliation, paraded, degraded, or simply discarded. From crusader to subject, the converted captive. Over decades of imprisonment, some crusaders stopped waiting for ransom. They began to integrate, or more accurately, were folded into the societies of their captors. The line between captive and subject blurred slowly. Conversion to Islam, either under duress or gradual acclimatization, led some captives to marry locally, take new names, and adopt local dress. Children born of these unions, if allowed, grew up between two worlds. Some were trained as Mamluks themselves, becoming part of the very armies that had enslaved their fathers. Others entered crafts or trades, becoming masons, carpenters, or even scribes. Arabic documents from the Mamluk period occasionally reference al-Furangi, the Franks living in port cities or interior towns, sometimes as retainers in noble households. Their Christianity, if retained, was quiet. Their origins fatting. They were not entirely Muslim, nor entirely European. They lived between definitions, in a world that had no name for them. Echoes in Europe, the return of the forgotten few. Occasionally, a long-held captive did return to Europe years, or even decades after capture. They came home changed. Some returned with darkened skin, foreign accents, or unfamiliar customs. They were stared at in market squares, whispered about in churches. Others returned speaking fluent Arabic and little Latin. Some had forgotten how to pray in the old words. A few had no living relatives left. In rare cases, their communities welcomed them as heroes, symbols of faith tested and unbroken. More often, they were pitied, feared, or dismissed. In the worst cases, they were tried for apostasy, suspected of having embraced Islam, and then returned only to escape judgment. A few were excommunicated, then absolved after public penance. Their years in darkness were not seen as holy suffering, but as suspect time unaccounted for, foreign and unnerving. They were, in essence, foreigners in their own homeland. Captivity and the changing meaning of the crusade. By the late 13th century, the idea of the crusade itself was undergoing transformation. No longer strictly about the Holy Land, crusading rhetoric was now being applied to wars in Spain, Eastern Europe, and even internal church conflicts. But the image of the noble crusader clad in mail, rescuing Jerusalem remained powerful in art and literature. What didn't remain was the memory of the captives. They were rarely depicted in songs or manuscripts. When mentioned at all, they were background figures, silent monks in captivity, pious sufferers, or tragic symbols of defeat. The actual lives of long-term captives, the labor, the conversions, the quiet deaths did not fit the narrative. And so they were excluded. Their stories were not written so much as forgotten. The institutions that tried to remember. Two religious orders, the Mercedarians and the Trinitarians, were founded in the 13th century with the explicit mission of redeeming Christian captives from Muslim lands. They fundraised across Europe, negotiated with Muslim rulers, and even offered themselves in exchange when ransoms could not be paid. Some of their records survive, offering rare glimpses into the world of redemption. Names of prisoners, sums paid, years spent in captivity. But these records are also selective. They focus on successful redemptions, not the many who could not be reached or who no longer wanted to return. They recorded transactions, not lives. And for every line in these ledgers, there were likely 100 voices never heard. The archaeology of absence. Modern historians and archaeologists continue to search for physical traces of these forgotten prisoners. In Byblos, a set of iron shackles was found in a tower room too small for livestock, likely used for human restraint. At Crac des Chevaliers, Templar graffiti includes prayers scratched in Latin beside Arabic numerals, suggesting a long period of multilingual confinement. In Cairo, records from Mamluk court documents reference foreign servants, with no origin listed, possibly former prisoners whose names and stories had long since been erased. The captives rarely left diaries. Their literacy was low, their conditions poor. But they left behind architecture, scratches, and witness accounts, all thin but haunting threads. From these we glimpse their outlines. Never clearly, but enough to know they were there. Reflections from the margins of history. The story of the Crusader captive is not about victory or defeat. It is not even about faith, ultimately. It is about waiting. Waiting for a ransom that never came. Waiting for a letter that never arrived. Waiting for a world that moved on without you. It is about the limits of memory, what history remembers, and what it allows to fall away. These men, anonymous in their suffering, challenge the neat narratives of crusade and chivalry. Their lives remind us that behind every holy war, there are quiet casualties, those not killed in battle, but endlessly stalled by it. They survived the war, but did not return from it. And so the question remains, when a soldier is forgotten by both his enemies and his own, who writes the final chapter of his life? Story 6, Walls of Bone, the Black Hole of Lacs. In the mist-cloaked heart of the Loire Valley, the mighty Château de Lacs looms over the Indre River. Today, it stands as a silent witness to centuries of political intrigue, royal visits, and military conflict. But beneath its majestic towers and elegant turrets, beneath the chapel where kings once knelt in prayer, lies something far darker. Hidden in the bedrock beneath Lacs is a prison, a black hole of stone and silence, carved from the very foundations of the earth. These were not cells in the modern sense. They were caves of cruelty, deep, cold, and utterly lightless. And for much of the 15th century, they held the enemies of the French crown. This is the story of the forgotten prisoners of Lacs, political captives, rebellious nobles, and nameless men condemned not to death, but to disappearance. A castle of kings and captives. Lacs had always been a place of consequence. Originally a Carolingian stronghold, the Château gained prominence under Henry II of England and his son Richard the Lionheart, who fortified it into a formidable Plantagenet bastion. But after the tumultuous struggles of the 13th and 14th centuries, Lacs passed into the hands of the French crown. It was Charles VII, reigning during the darkest days of the Hundred Years' War, who transformed it into a royal prison, a place to quietly hold and break those who opposed him. Locks did not become famous for executions. It became infamous for what it didn't do. It didn't release. It didn't explain. It simply held until the world forgot who had been placed there. The prison beneath the keep. The prison of Locks was carved out of white Touraine limestone, several meters below the floor of the main keep. The walls, porous and damp, exhaled moisture year-round. The ceilings were low, the passages narrow. There were no windows, no light, no heat. The most feared part of the prison was known simply as the oubliette, from the French word oublier, to forget. An oubliette was not a cell. It was a hole in the ground, accessed only by a narrow opening from above. Prisoners were lowered by rope, and once inside there was no ladder, no stairs, no escape. Some oubliettes were large enough for a man to stand, others were barely coffin-sized. They were not always used for death. They were used for indefinite holding, where daylight, time, and the self slowly ceased to exist. Who was imprisoned here? Unlike the Crusader dungeons of the East, the prisoners of Locks were primarily political. They were lords and noblemen who opposed Charles VII or conspired with the English, clerics who meddled in secular power struggles, military captains, mercenaries, or men accused of treason. Occasionally, entire families were imprisoned, spouses and children included. One of the most famous prisoners of Locks was Jean de Buell, a captain of Charles VII who briefly fell from favor. He later wrote of his confinement in a dungeon so dark and narrow that he couldn't stretch out his legs. He survived, was released, and returned to royal service. Others were not so fortunate. Many entered with names, but the castle's records, when they exist, often refer to prisoners simply as le prisonnier or celui d'en bas, the one below. Over time, their identities were lost. They became residents of the stone. A day without light. For a prisoner in Locks, a day was not a meaningful unit of time. There was no light to distinguish morning from night. Food, often gruel or stale bread, was delivered through hatches at irregular intervals. Water seeped from the walls or was offered in earthen pots. Rats were frequent, so were lice, so was rot. There was no fire. In winter, prisoners froze. In summer, they sweltered without air. Those held in oubliettes could not lie flat. They could not stand. Many developed permanent spinal deformities. Some lost their minds within weeks. Others grew silent, staring endlessly at the stone in front of them as their thoughts folded inwards. Torture by time. Locks was not known for sadistic torture devices. It had no need of them. The torture was environmental. Time itself in such a place became a weapon. A man could not plan for tomorrow, could not count his days, could not even count on food. There are whispered records of prisoners who ate their own garments or attempted to chew stone out of starvation and madness. Some scratched marks into the walls to measure time, but these carvings often ended abruptly. The rhythm broken, the carver no longer able or willing to continue. One prisoner wrote a Latin psalm over and over again on every inch of the wall he could reach, until the lines began to blur and deform. The writing trails off after the 23rd verse of Psalm 88, a lament that ends. You have taken from me friend and neighbor, darkness is my only companion. The iron cages of Louis XI. Though our primary focus is the 15th century, the legacy of Locks' cruelty reached a chilling climax under King Louis XI, son of Charles VII, who used the fortress in the late 1400s for psychological torture. Louis XI is said to have designed or ordered the use of iron cages, suspended in the air within dungeon chambers. These cages were built just large enough to contain a crouching man who could not stand, sit, or lie down fully. Prisoners were placed in these for months, sometimes years. One such victim was Cardinal Jean Ballou, once Louis's closest advisor, later accused of treason. Ballou reportedly spent 11 years in an iron cage at Locks. Whether all the stories are true is debated, but the fear they inspired was very real. Locks became a place of warning, whispered about in courts and battle camps, a threat more effective than exile because it promised not death, but disappearance. Carvings in the stone. Unlike the desert prisons of the Crusades, Locks offers more material evidence of its captives. Throughout the cells, walls are carved with names, often half-scratched or incomplete. Crosses and saints, especially St. Leonard, the patron saint of prisoners. Coats of arms, often unfinished, suggesting noble origin and broken hope. Faces, some serene, others screaming. One prisoner carved a full rosary into the wall bead by bead, using only a nail and his fingernails when the nail dulled. Another etched what appears to be a calendar, though its accuracy is impossible to confirm. It ends after 143 squares. A castle above, a tomb below. Above the dungeons, life in the shadehouse continued. Kings came and went, courtiers plotted, masses were held in the chapel, visitors arrived, feasted, and departed. None of them heard the captives directly below their feet. It was a structure built on silence, literally. The stones of the keep muffled sound. Even screams, if they came, could not pass. And over time, the captives did not scream. They whispered. Then they fell silent. They became part of the architecture, living memories entombed before death. A question left in the walls. Locks is now a heritage site. Tourists visit its towers and admire its gardens. They descend into the old dungeons, marvel at the gloom, then climb back into sunlight. But some of the carvings remain. So do the iron hooks, the narrow stone corridors, the cold walls that still leak water in winter. You can feel the weight of waiting there, centuries of it. The prisoners of Locks were not heretics or criminals. Many were simply inconvenient. Their stories were removed from the record, their sentences unspoken, their release never planned. Their existence challenges the notion of justice, of memory, of humanity. And so one must ask, if a man is buried in stone, but not in soil forgotten, but not dead, where does his story truly end? In the dark corridors beneath the Château de Locks, the air was not just stale, it was ancient. By the mid-15th century, the fortress had evolved fully into a tool of political control, and its prisoners were no longer merely the casualties of war, but symbols of an invisible war within the kingdom. This was the age of Louis XI, called the Universal Spider by his enemies for the vast web of intrigue he spun. Known for his paranoia and pragmatism, Louis saw the state not as a chivalric ideal, but as a machine to be oiled with information, surveillance, and quiet repression. His enemies didn't disappear in a flash of violence, they simply vanished into stone. Now, Locks was no longer just a castle. It was an administrative tomb, and its prisoners were not expected to be heard from again. This section explores what it meant to be a prisoner of the crown, not through formal conviction, but through suspicion. It looks at the kinds of men Louis XI imprisoned, the psychological strategies he used to break them, and the creeping erosion of justice beneath royal authority. The King's Web, Louis XI and his strategy of control. Louis XI reigned from 1461 to 1483, and his vision of kingship differed starkly from his predecessors. He avoided ceremony, preferred wool to ermine, and refused to hold court in the traditional sense. Instead, he ruled through a system of spies, informants, secret letters, and regional strongmen. His enemies were not only foreign armies, but his own nobles, particularly the great dukes of Burgundy and Brittany. Louis's primary threat came from Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a man of spectacle, strength, and traditional knightly pride. Unlike Louis, Charles believed in open war and noble privilege. Louis believed in secrets, leverage, and the strategic disappearance of dissenters. Locks under Louis's rule became a tool not for immediate retaliation, but for long-term silencing. You weren't sent to Locks to make a point. You were sent there so no point had to be made at all. The iron cages, fact and fear. One of the most enduring legends of Locks under Louis XI is the use of iron cages, or fillets, as they were mockingly called. These were small, cramped structures made of lattice iron, just large enough for a man to sit but not lie down or stand upright. Contemporaries claimed these cages were hung inside the castle's keep, in rooms with high, cold ceilings and no heat. The prisoners were left in semi-darkness, sometimes for years, as punishment for betrayal or even mere distrust. The most famous victim was Cardinal Jean Ballou, a high-ranking advisor who fell out of favor after negotiating and possibly conspiring with Charles the Bold. Once arrested, Ballou was placed in an iron cage for nearly 11 years. He was not tortured with tools. He was not beaten. He was merely confined, in conditions designed to unmake the man. He survived but was never quite the same again. Upon release, he returned to church service, but his influence waned. He had been removed from the chessboard. And that perhaps was Louis's true genius. He didn't destroy enemies, he reduced them. Why imprisonment instead of execution? The answer lies in optics and leverage. Executing a noble, particularly a highborn cleric or foreign agent, created problems. It could provoke retaliation from other powerful houses, undermine royal legitimacy, strengthen martyrdom myths. But imprisonment, that was cleaner. It removed the threat. It offered the illusion of mercy. It allowed for negotiation leverage. The prisoner could be traded, ransomed, or used as a bargaining chip. But over time, many were simply left to rot. The silence became the sentence. In this system, justice was less a verdict than a delay, and Locks was the ideal warehouse for unresolved grievances. The bureaucracy of forgotten men. As Louis XI expanded the use of secret imprisonment, a small bureaucracy emerged to manage it. The prisoners of Locks and other state dungeons, like Plessis-les-Tours, were recorded in hidden ledgers, maintained by trusted scribes and occasionally shown to royal advisors. These records were often coded or vague, listing prisoners as M. de L. Monsieur of Locks, El Homme Noir, the black man, possibly referencing clothing or status. Celui qui est là, the one who is there. The purpose was not to inform, but to maintain deniability. Even the jailers often didn't know who their prisoners were or why they had been confined. They followed orders, provided minimal sustenance, and avoided eye contact. Over time, it became possible for a man to be held without anyone remembering why. This was not incompetence. It was policy. Conditions of long-term captivity. For long-term prisoners, those not in oubliettes or cages, there was a different kind of slow unraveling. These men were often held in small stone rooms with a wooden bench or straw mattress, a bucket for waste, a slit in the wall for food. The rooms were barely wider than the man himself. The air was damp, the walls coated with green mold in winter. Some were allowed to read, but only church-approved texts. Others were given ink and parchment, but no way to send their writing. These conditions were not designed to kill. They were designed to keep the body alive while the mind softened. The prisoner would become less defiant, less certain of his innocence, less useful to his allies. Over years, he might even forget who had placed him there. Whispers from the cells. Occasionally, fragments of writing or second-hand reports reveal how prisoners coped. One captive scratched a full confession into the wall, apologizing to Louis XI for an unspecified betrayal. He begged for the chance to serve again. Another, believed to be a noble from Anjou, inscribed a mock will into the plaster, bequeathing his silence to the dust and the king. Some prisoners marked the wall with tally lines, thousands of them, running in curved arcs around the cell. The longest of these sets recorded 1,241 marks, though we do not know what unit of time they represented. Were they days? Were they meals? Were they simply a way to keep the mind anchored? We cannot say. Who visited the forgotten? Very few ever saw the prisoners once they were confined. Clerics were sometimes sent to offer absolution, but only under orders. Doctors visited if the prisoner fell ill, but often too late to intervene meaningfully. Messengers arrived to inquire about ransoms, but most of those negotiations stalled or vanished. The only constant presence was the jailer, a man often as anonymous as his charges. Some records suggest that jailers were rotated frequently to prevent attachments or collusion. And yet, in at least one recorded case, a jailer secretly helped a prisoner smuggle out a letter written in Latin and sewn into the lining of a tunic. It was addressed not to family, but to the Virgin Mary, asking for a moment of sun before death. Whether it was ever read, we do not know. The iron logic of silence. By 1470, Locks had ceased to be merely a prison, it had become a statement. It told the nobles of France, "You may not be executed. You may not be judged. But you can be removed. And if you are removed, no one will speak your name. No ballads will mourn you. No grave will mark your fall. You will become a shadow of a man, a whisper in stone. And perhaps worst of all, you will still be alive, long after your usefulness is gone." A final reflection. In the records of Locks, there is no closure, only lists of names that end abruptly. Some prisoners are marked as décédé, deceased, with no date. Others have no ending at all, just a line that trails off. These were not martyrs, not villains, not heroes. They were men who stood on the wrong side of a whisper. Their punishment was not to be broken. It was to be unmade. And so we must ask, when memory is denied, when even suffering goes unspoken, how is history supposed to remember? By the end of the 15th century, the Château de Locks had solidified its reputation not just as a royal residence, but as a repository of the unwanted. Those who entered its lower chambers, nobles fallen from favor, spies caught between allegiances, ecclesiastics who whispered too freely, left no grand final words, no heroic testaments. They were not executed in the square for the public to witness. They were not even displayed in iron cages, as was common in England or Italy. Instead, they were folded silently into the stone itself, absorbed into the memory of a building designed to remember nothing. And though Locks' prison would eventually empty, and the kings who used it would die, its legacy would linger not as a tale of violence, but as a study in the quiet power of erasure. This final section closes the story of Locks by exploring the afterlives of its captives, the fading significance of its dungeons, and how modern eyes might reinterpret these cold spaces of silence. The deaths without dates. One of the most haunting facts about Locks is the lack of death records. Even with meticulous royal accounting and scribal bureaucracy, there remains a mysterious absence of notations, marking the ends of many prisoners' lives. Where did they go? Some certainly died in the cells, and were buried without ceremony in the soft earth outside the walls. Others may have been moved in secret, transferred to other prisons, or placed under monastic supervision after years of silence. A few perhaps were released quietly, under the condition of permanent exile or clerical retreat. But most were simply no longer listed. In a surviving 1492 register, A section once labeled Captives Ancients, Ancient Captives, has lines scratched out, overwritten, or left blank. The implication: they had outlived their usefulness even as prisoners. Their existence was no longer needed, even as a threat. They weren't just punished. They were forgotten on purpose. What became of the jailers? Strangely, some of the best preserved records from locks are not about the prisoners, but about those who watched them. Rotations of staff. Expenses for food, candles, tools. Disputes over salary or conditions. The jailers of locks were not sadists. They were low-ranking officials, often rotated between castles, abbeys, and garrisons. For them, guarding a silent prisoner for 10 years was a matter of paperwork and discipline, not ideology. And yet some left their marks. Notes of prisoners refusing food. Descriptions of illnesses. Elham Grise de la Chambre Basse Taus sang, "The gray man of the lower chamber coughs blood." Rare comments like "Ni parle plus," speaks no more. These are among the only surviving acknowledgments of what went on behind the walls. The post-Louis era, what changed? After the death of Louis XI in 1483, France's political climate slowly shifted. His son, Charles VIII, inherited both his kingdom and the fortress of Locks. But Charles, more interested in Italian campaigns and court pageantry, did not share his father's love for strategic imprisonment. Gradually, Locks' prison wing was used less frequently. By the early 16th century, the practice of secret, indefinite confinement fell out of favor, at least for nobles. Justice became more public again through courts, trials, and formal accusations. The rise of printing made silence more dangerous. Rumors traveled faster than prisons could contain them. Nobles demanded clear sentences, not vanishing acts. And so, one by one, the cells of Locks were emptied, not ceremoniously, just quietly. Eventually, only the scratches in the stone remained. The Stone Testament, graffiti, and ghosts. Today, many of the prison carvings are still visible. Some are devotional crosses, prayers, saints. Others are heraldic family crests, initials, Latin mottos. A few are desperate scratched names repeating endlessly, like someone writing their own identity over and over to keep it from dissolving. One haunting set of initials reads, PD 1473, Encore Vivant Sewell. Still alive, alone. Another features a carved calendar grid, with all 31 days of January marked, then fading into blank space, suggesting an effort to regain time in a world designed to remove it. There are no portraits, no drawings of escape, no depictions of home. Only marks made to prove the carver once existed. Legacy of the Forgotten. The prison of Locks did not become a place of legend like the Tower of London or the Bastille. There were no mass revolts, no dramatic escapes, no last-minute reprieves. Its legacy is quiet, which may be why it's so disturbing. It represents the administrative disappearance of humans, those whom a king wanted erased not violently, but neatly. It represents a chapter of history when absence was power. And it reminds us that some of history's most effective tools of repression leave no trace but silence. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Romantic historians rediscovered Locks, but they focused on the grand halls and royal visitors. The prison beneath remained a curiosity, not a central subject. Even in modern scholarship, the prisoners of Locks are appendices, footnotes in stories about kings. And yet, their experience reveals more about the nature of power than any coronation ever could. Modern reinterpretation. Today, Locks is a heritage site, and its prison can be toured dimly lit, made safe for modern feet. Visitors descend into the narrow stone chambers. Guides speak in hushed tones about oubliettes and iron cages. Some visitors linger in silence. Others take photos, capturing shadows on limestone walls. But even with light and safety, the feeling remains. That time does not flow normally here. That speech feels out of place. That somewhere behind the walls, a name is still trying to resurface. Historians now study locks as an example of late medieval state control, and even draw comparisons to modern solitary confinement. Prison reform advocates have cited these dungeons when arguing against the long-term psychological effects of isolation. In this way, the captives of locks, though nameless, still contribute to conversations about justice. Their absence has become a presence. What is the cost of disappearance? In literature, disappearance often signals drama, but at locks it was administrative, bureaucratic, efficient. The real terror was not in chains or screams, but in dull routine: bread, water, dark. Each day was the same, until memory itself became unreliable. These men were not broken by pain, but by invisibility. And so we're left with the final question. What does history owe to those who left no record except stone? What do we do with lives that were neither glorified nor condemned, only set aside? Can we honor them even now? Not with names, perhaps, but with acknowledgement that in the kingdom of the living they once waited. And the stone remembers.